For 8 years of marriage, I carried the heavy burden of being the wife who could not give her husband a child. I endured the whispered pity and the pointed family jokes in absolute silence. Then, at a lavish backyard party, my husband stood on a stage holding my own sister and announced they were having twins. He thought he had broken me completely. He thought I would run away crying. Instead, I quietly handed him divorce papers and the deed to our luxury estate. When he gleefully signed them, he had no idea he was signing his own financial death warrant. My name is Jocelyn. I am 33 years old and I work as a forensic accountant. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who betrayed your trust. The afternoon sun beat down on the perfectly manicured lawn of my parents' house in the wealthy suburbs of Chicago. It was supposed to be a standard family gathering to celebrate my sister Brittany turning 30. At least that is what the invitation said. The backyard was transformed into a pastel wonderland. Enormous arches of pink and blue balloons framed the patio. Waitstaff in crisp white shirts circulated with trays of expensive champagne and artisanal appetizers. My parents, Richard and Patricia, spared no expense whenever Brittany was involved. She was their golden child, the successful lifestyle influencer who could do no wrong. I was just the practical older sister who worked long hours analyzing corporate fraud and balancing ledgers. I stood near the edge of the patio, holding a glass of sparkling water. My husband Trent was nowhere to be found. He had excused himself earlier, claiming he needed to take an urgent call from his investment fund. At 35, Trent was the picture of corporate arrogance. He wore custom suits, drove expensive cars, and constantly reminded everyone of his regional director title. For 8 years, he also constantly reminded me of what I was failing to give him: an heir. Every month that passed, without a pregnancy, was treated as my personal failure. My mother, Patricia, would sigh loudly at family dinners and tell me I needed to stop working so hard and focus on my duties as a wife. I took the blame quietly. I absorbed their passive-aggressive comments and their pitying looks. Suddenly, the upbeat music faded out. A microphone screeched slightly as it was turned on. I looked up and saw Trent standing on the raised wooden deck that my father had built last summer. He was not alone. Brittany was standing right next to him. She wore a tight white dress that accentuated a noticeable curve in her stomach, a curve she had been passing off as weight gain to her social media followers for months. "Can I have everyone's attention, please?" Trent called out. The chatter of 50 elite guests died down immediately. People turned toward the stage holding their crystal glasses. Trent wrapped his arm securely around my sister's waist. He pulled her close in a way that made my stomach drop. "For 8 years I have waited to become a father," Trent announced, his voice booming over the speakers. "For 8 years I have been incredibly patient with a wife who simply could not give me an heir." The collective gasp from the guests was audible. People turned their heads to stare at me. I felt the heat of their pitying glances, but I kept my face perfectly still. Trent smiled down at Brittany and kissed the top of her head. "But a man can only wait so long," he continued. "I finally found a real woman to carry my bloodline. Brittany and I are thrilled to announce that we are having twins." Right on cue, two massive cannons flanking the stage erupted. A thick cloud of pink and blue confetti blasted into the sky, raining down over the shocked crowd. The silence that followed the explosion was deafening. Guests stood frozen with their mouths open, looking back and forth between the stage and where I was standing. I did not look at the crowd. I looked at my parents. My father, Richard, stared at the ground, avoiding my eyes completely. My mother, Patricia, stood near the catering table with her chin raised. She did not look shocked. She looked smug. She had always favored Brittany, and in her twisted mind, my sister providing grandchildren somehow justified this horrific public betrayal. She gave me a look that silently told me to accept my defeat and leave quietly. They all expected me to break down. They expected the barren, bitter wife to run out of the backyard in a river of tears. They wanted a show of my humiliation. Instead, I took a slow, deliberate sip of my sparkling water. I set the glass down on a nearby table. I smoothed the wrinkles from my tailored blazer and adjusted the strap of my Hermes Kelly bag. Then I began to walk toward the stage. The crowd parted for me like the Red Sea. Nobody breathed. The only sound was the crunch of my designer heels against the gravel path. Trent watched me approach with a confident smirk plastered across his face. He puffed out his chest, expecting me to scream or slap him. Brittany clung to his arm, attempting to look like an innocent victim who had just been swept away by true love. I climbed the 3 wooden steps onto the deck. I stopped exactly 2 feet in front of them. The confetti was still settling around our feet. "Congratulations, Trent," I said. My voice was perfectly calm. It carried easily over the silent yard, even without a microphone. Trent blinked, his arrogant smile faltering for just a fraction of a second. "You are not going to yell?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. "I do not waste energy on bad investments," I replied. I reached into my bag and pulled out a thick manila folder. I held it out to him. "Here are the divorce papers. I have already signed them. You keep the Hamptons house." Trent's eyes lit up with greedy triumph. He genuinely believed his public humiliation tactic had worked perfectly. He thought I was so broken, so desperate to escape the embarrassment, that I was simply surrendering our multi-million-dollar vacation home just to get away from him. He snatched the folder from my hands. He pulled a gold fountain pen from his breast pocket. He did not bother to read the pages. He just flipped to the back and signed his name with a dramatic flourish right there on the stage. He handed the folder back to me with a victorious grin. "Pleasure doing business with you, Jocelyn," he mocked. I took the folder and slid it safely back into my bag. I stepped closer to him, invading his personal space. I leaned up right next to his ear, so only he and my sister could hear my next words. "Make sure you pay the 4 months of back mortgage," I whispered softly. "The bank forecloses on Tuesday." I stepped back and watched the blood completely drain from his face. His confident smirk vanished, replaced by a look of sheer terror. Before he could process what I had just said, I turned around and walked down the stairs, leaving him and his pregnant mistress standing in their shower of pink and blue confetti. The sound of the slap echoed sharply against the imported marble countertops of my parents' custom kitchen. My cheek burned with a sudden stinging heat, but I did not bring my hand up to touch it. I simply stood my ground and stared at my mother. Patricia stood breathing heavily with her hands still raised in the air. Beside her, my father Richard watched with his arms crossed over his chest, offering absolutely no defense for me. "Stop embarrassing us right this second," Patricia hissed. Her face was flushed with anger, completely destroying her carefully manicured country club facade. "Your sister is finally giving this family the heirs we have been praying for. She is doing what you failed to do for 8 years. The least you can do is bow out gracefully instead of throwing a bitter tantrum in front of our most important guests. And you will leave the keys to the Porsche on the counter," my father added, his voice low and commanding. "Trent needs a reliable vehicle for his commute to the city now that he has a growing family to support. You can call a cab to get back to your apartment." I looked at them and saw the exact same parents who had forced me to hand over my high school graduation gift money so Brittany could buy a designer wardrobe for her college sorority rush. They had always demanded I strip myself bare to keep Brittany warm. I was expected to finance her life, tolerate her theft, and applaud her while she did it. They genuinely believed I would surrender my car to the man who just broke my heart simply because they demanded it. Before I could formulate a response, the heavy swinging door of the kitchen pushed open with a violent shove. The sudden movement startled my parents, causing them to step back. DeAndre walked into the room. At 32 years old, DeAndre was a formidable presence. He was a highly successful corporate litigator, and his tall athletic frame filled the doorway. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that contrasted sharply with the pastel party clothes everyone else was wearing. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a heavy set of car keys, and tossed them casually into the stainless steel sink. They hit the metal with a loud, jarring clatter. "That car is registered to my law firm," Patricia DeAndre said. His voice was smooth but carried the lethal precision of a man used to destroying people in a courtroom. "Trent will not be driving it anywhere." DeAndre turned his sharp gaze toward the hallway just as Brittany and Trent burst into the kitchen. Trent looked panicked, undoubtedly sweating over the foreclosure comment I had just dropped on him, while Brittany was already working up a fresh batch of tears to play the victim. And Brittany DeAndre continued ignoring Trent entirely. "You forgot to sign our final divorce settlement before getting knocked up by another man." Brittany gasped and immediately hid behind Trent, clutching his arm tightly. "He is threatening me, Trent," she sobbed, her voice trembling with perfect theatrical timing. DeAndre was always so controlling. He never let me breathe. He financially abused me for years. I had to find comfort somewhere else. I had to run to you because I was terrified of him." Trent puffed out his chest, trying to play the heroic protector in front of my parents. He took an aggressive step toward DeAndre, raising his chin. "You need to back off right now," Trent snarled. "Brittany is my family now. If you ever come near her or my babies again, I will destroy you." DeAndre did not even blink. He just looked at Trent like he was a minor inconvenience stuck to the bottom of his shoe. I decided it was time to end the performance. I unzipped my bag again and pulled out my encrypted work tablet. As a forensic accountant, I made a living tracking down money that people tried very hard to hide. Finding my sister careless spending had been child's play. Financially abused. I asked, tapping the screen of my tablet to unlock it. I swiped open a highly detailed spreadsheet I had compiled over the last 48 hours. "That is a fascinating choice of words, Brittany. Let us look at the actual numbers." I held the tablet up, reading directly from the screen so everyone in the room could hear the exact figures. On March 12th, you charged $1,200 to DeAndre's secondary black card for a weekend suite at the Four Seasons. On April 5th, you used his business account to purchase 2 first-class tickets to Miami for you and Trent. On May 18th, you charged a $4,000 shopping spree at Tiffany & Company, billing it to DeAndre firm as a corporate expense. I looked up from the screen, staring dead into my sister's panicked eyes. "For the past 6 months, you have spent exactly $42,500 of DeAndre hard-earned money to finance your affair with my husband. You were not running from a controlling monster. You were using a corporate litigator credit limit to play house with a regional director who is currently drowning in hidden debt." The kitchen fell into a stunned, breathless silence. Brittany's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Her fake tears vanished completely, replaced by the terrified look of a fraudster caught red-handed. Trent stared at her, his heroic posture deflating instantly, as he realized his new pregnant girlfriend had been entirely funded by her soon-to-be ex-husband. My parents looked back and forth between us, utterly speechless. Their golden child was standing in front of them, exposed as a thief and a liar. DeAndre slowly turned his head to look at me. The coldness in his eyes melted into a look of absolute professional respect. A sharp, dangerous smile spread across his face. "You want to burn their empire to the ground, partner." I did not hesitate. I looked at the man who had just dismantled my sister-victim narrative in under a minute and gave him a single sharp nod. "Yes," I said, "let us burn it all down." We walked out of the kitchen together, leaving my parents and the cheating couple in a state of absolute shock. We bypassed the pastel balloons, the catering staff, and the lingering guests on the front lawn. DeAndre unlocked his sleek black Audi sedan, parked discreetly at the end of the long, sweeping driveway. We got inside, and the heavy doors clicked shut, sealing us in a quiet sanctuary, away from the circus my family had created. The leather seats were cool against my skin. The silence between us was not awkward. It was the calculated quiet of 2 professionals shifting from personal betrayal to tactical warfare. DeAndre started the engine but did not pull away from the curb immediately. He turned to me, resting his arm on the steering wheel. The afternoon sun caught the sharp angles of his face, highlighting the intense focus in his eyes. "So," DeAndre said, his voice a low, calm rumble, "we have a sterile corporate director and a social media influencer playing house. How deep does the financial rot actually go, Jocelyn?" I unzipped my designer bag and pulled out my encrypted work tablet. I typed in my complex alphanumeric passcode and opened a secure hidden cloud drive. I handed the device to him. Trent is not a successful fund manager, I explained, leaning back against the leather seat and letting out a long breath. He portrays himself as a top-tier regional director handling high-net-worth portfolios. In reality, he is a glorified middleman who got greedy and careless. 2 years ago, he started siphoning his own performance bonuses and taking massive personal loans to invest in highly volatile, unregulated cryptocurrency markets. DeAndre scrolled through the complex spreadsheets, his eyes scanning the highlighted red columns with the speed of a seasoned litigator. He zoomed in on a specific web of shell companies I had mapped out. He leveraged everything he had, DeAndre noted. Exactly, I replied. He thought he was an absolute financial genius. He thought he could outsmart the market algorithms. He lost $5 million in the span of 18 months. He has been frantically moving money between offshore shell companies, trying to cover his tracks and pay the minimum interest on his margin calls. He is completely insolvent. Every designer suit he wears and every expensive dinner he buys is funded by debt. And the Hamptons house, DeAndre asked, glancing at me with a raised eyebrow. The one you just gladly handed over to him on a silver platter. I saw the financial collapse coming a year ago, I told him. I am a senior forensic accountant, DeAndre. You cannot hide missing millions from someone who literally hunts missing money for a living. When I discovered what he was doing, I quietly and meticulously restructured our marital assets. I convinced him to put the Hamptons property entirely in his name through a holding company to protect it from impending capital gains taxes. He was far too arrogant to read the fine print of the documents my lawyers drafted. By taking sole ownership of that asset, he also absorbed all the hidden liabilities attached to it. The $5 million debt is now legally bound to that property and entirely his responsibility. I walked away completely clean. DeAndre let out a low whistle of genuine professional appreciation. He handed the tablet back to me and reached into his tailored jacket pocket. He pulled out a folded stack of banking statements and dropped them onto the center console between us. Your turn, DeAndre said. Look at page 3. I picked up the heavy stock paper. They were detailed transaction logs for a high-yield premium credit card. The primary account belonged to DeAndre, but the authorized user was Brittany. I scanned the itemized lines and felt a cold smile forming on my face. Trent has been telling Brittany he is an old money millionaire, I observed, piecing the psychological puzzle together. He needed to keep up appearances to secure her as his beautiful trophy wife. But he has no liquid cash to fund the lifestyle she demands. And Brittany thought she was upgrading. DeAndre finished for me, his tone entirely void of emotion. She wanted the Hamptons lifestyle she always envied you for. But Trent could not afford the luxury hotels or the romantic weekend getaways. So Brittany funded her own affair using my money. Look at the specific charges, Jocelyn. I read them aloud, tracing the lines with my manicured finger. $4,000 at the Ritz-Carlton in Manhattan. $2,000 for couples spa treatments in Aspen. $800 for a private helicopter tour over the Hudson. A $5,000 charge at a luxury boutique in Paris during a trip she claimed was a solo yoga retreat. She was paying for his illusion of wealth using my law firm capital. DeAndre said, his grip tightening slightly on the steering wheel. Trent is a broke fraud using your sister for access to my bank accounts. And your sister is a gold digger who accidentally trapped herself with a bankrupt criminal. The sheer irony of their situation was almost poetic. My parents had just mortgaged their pride to celebrate a pregnancy built on a foundation of absolute financial ruin. Brittany thought she had stolen a wealthy prize. Trent thought he had secured a naive, beautiful heir provider. They were two parasites feeding off each other, entirely unaware that the host body had just cut them off completely. We have everything we need to dismantle them, DeAndre said. He shifted the car into drive. I will file the divorce papers against Brittany on Monday morning at exactly 8 o'clock. I will include a massive civil suit for the deliberate misappropriation of marital assets. I am going to freeze every single account she has access to. And I am going to make sure Trent cannot afford a lawyer to defend her, I replied. As DeAndre pulled the Audi away from the curb and steered us out of the wealthy suburban neighborhood, my phone vibrated sharply in my lap. I picked it up. A text message from Trent illuminated the screen. The preview showed a string of frantic, misspelled words. I unlocked the phone and opened the message. "Jocelyn, what did you do? My personal checking account is completely locked. My corporate cards are declining at the bar. The bank says there is a federal hold on all my assets. Fix this right now or I swear I will make you pay." I read the text aloud to DeAndre. He chuckled a deep, resonant sound that filled the quiet cabin of the car. "What are you going to tell him?" DeAndre asked, keeping his eyes focused on the road ahead. I tapped the bright screen and typed out my response with slow, deliberate precision. I did not feel an ounce of pity for the man who had just humiliated me in front of my entire family. I looked over at DeAndre and gave him a cold, calculating smile. Because I just triggered an IRS audit. Trent stormed into the glass-walled lobby of Vanguard Financial at exactly 8 o'clock the next morning. He barked orders at his assistant, demanding a double espresso and shutting the heavy oak door to his corner office with a violent slam. His hands shook uncontrollably as he opened his laptop. The text I had sent him last night about the IRS audit had kept him awake until dawn, pacing the hardwood floors of his luxury apartment. He desperately needed to prove to himself that I was bluffing. He logged into his primary banking portal. A bright red error message flashed across the screen. "Access denied. Contact branch administrator." He tried his offshore accounts. Frozen. He tried his corporate expense account. Suspended pending investigation. Trent slammed his fist onto his mahogany desk. He snatched his cell phone and dialed his high-priced divorce attorney, Arthur Pendleton. "Arthur, I need you to file an emergency motion right now," Trent shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "Jocelyn locked me out of everything. I want spousal support filed today. She owns a highly profitable forensic accounting firm, and I'm accustomed to a specific standard of living. I want half her business and a massive monthly alimony payment. Drain her dry." Across the city, I sat in my sleek corner office overlooking the Chicago River. My desk was immaculate, holding only a single manila folder and a cup of black coffee. I had been waiting for this exact moment for 6 months. Every late night spent tracing digital breadcrumbs and untangling Trent's chaotic web of lies had led to this morning. When my direct line rang and the caller ID flashed the name of Trent's aggressive legal counsel, I answered on the first ring. "Good morning, Arthur," I said, keeping my tone pleasant and entirely professional. "Jocelyn, this is Arthur Pendleton representing Trent." The voice boomed over the line, dripping with false authority. "Your petty stunt with the bank accounts ends today. If you do not unfreeze my client's assets within the hour, we will be filing for immediate emergency spousal support. Trent is entitled to maintain his lifestyle, and a judge will strip your firm to the studs to ensure it." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. "Arthur, before you waste billable hours drafting any motions, I highly suggest you turn to page 47, section 4 of the divorce decree your client enthusiastically signed yesterday afternoon." I heard the rustling of paper over the speakerphone. "Trent signed a standard property transfer," Arthur snapped, though his voice wavered slightly. "Trent signed a transfer of ownership for Ocean View Holdings, LLC, the shell company that holds the deed to the Hamptons estate," I corrected smoothly. What Trent did not bother to read because he was too busy showing off for his pregnant mistress was the liability clause. By taking sole ownership of that LLC, he legally assumed all of its corporate debts. "What debts?" Arthur asked. The arrogance was completely gone from his tone, replaced by the sharp edge of professional alarm. "The $5 million in cryptocurrency margin calls that Trent tried to hide from his corporate bosses," I explained, leaning back in my ergonomic chair. "He used the Hamptons property as collateral to fund a string of disastrous trades over the last 18 months. I merely structured the divorce settlement so that the debt stayed exactly where it belonged, with him. He did not win a multi-million-dollar beach house. He accepted a $5 million anchor tied directly to his neck." The silence on the line was absolute. I could practically hear the gears turning in the attorney's head as he realized his client had walked blindly into a financial slaughterhouse. Furthermore, I continued, refusing to give him a second to breathe. Trent commingled his fraudulent crypto investments with his corporate expense accounts. That is why the IRS froze his assets. They are currently auditing him for wire fraud and tax evasion. As his ex-wife, I am completely insulated from his criminal activity. If you want to take me to court for alimony, Arthur, be my guest. But I assure you any judge will find that a convicted felon has no right to my firm's profits. Arthur hung up the phone without saying another word. Back at Vanguard Financial, Trent sat at his desk chewing his thumbnail down to the quick. His desk phone rang and he snatched the receiver. Arthur, tell me you destroyed her. I am dropping you as a client effective immediately, Arthur said coldly. You signed a binding legal document transferring $5 million of hidden debt directly into your own name. You lied to me about your financial status, and you are currently the target of a federal tax investigation. Do not call this office again. The line went dead. Trent stared at the receiver in horror. The walls of his prestigious office felt like they were closing in on him. He looked out through the glass partitions and saw two men in dark suits speaking with his branch manager. They were holding official-looking badges, federal agents. Panic, raw and suffocating, seized Trent by the throat. He grabbed his cell phone and ducked under his desk, hiding like a cornered rat. He dialed Brittany's number. She answered on the second ring, her voice bright and cheerful, completely oblivious to the impending disaster. Hey, babe, she chirped. I am just looking at nursery colors online. Do you think we should go with sage green or soft gray for the twins? Brittany, listen to me, Trent hissed, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Forget the nursery. I need you to go to your parents right now. What? Brittany asked, her cheerful tone vanishing. Why? What is going on, Trent? Jocelyn set a trap. He growled, sweat pouring down his face and soaking the collar of his custom shirt. She transferred all my hidden debt to my name and called the feds. They are in my office lobby right now. We need $1 million in cash by Friday, or I go to jail for wire fraud. Brittany did not pack a bag for a romantic getaway. She packed a bag for a guilt trip. Less than 20 minutes after Trent hung up the phone, my sister sped her rented SUV into our parents' perfectly paved driveway. She threw open the front door of their pristine suburban house and collapsed onto the plush white sofa in the formal living room. She unleashed a torrent of hysterical, hyperventilating tears perfectly timed for maximum emotional impact. My mother dropped her gardening shears and rushed to her side. My father emerged from his home office looking alarmed. Brittany clung to my mother's blouse, sobbing so violently her shoulders shook. She did not confess that Trent was a fraud. She did not admit that she had been funding their luxury affair with her husband's law firm account. Instead, she looked at our parents with wide, innocent eyes and deployed the ultimate manipulation. She blamed my barren womb. Jocelyn has completely lost her mind, Brittany wailed, burying her face in her hands. She is so insanely jealous of my pregnancy that she is trying to destroy us. She used her forensic accounting software to illegally hack into Trent banking portals. She manufactured a fake digital paper trail and framed him for millions of dollars in debt just to trigger a federal audit. She wants to freeze his money so my babies starve. My parents did not question the absurdity of this claim. They did not pause to consider that a senior forensic accountant cannot magically invent $5 million of cryptocurrency losses. They simply accepted the narrative because it fit their long-standing belief that I was a bitter, inadequate woman. Patricia stroked Brittany's blonde hair, cooing softly while shooting daggers at the wall, as if I were standing right there. Trent arrived an hour later, playing the role of the stressed but noble patriarch to absolute perfection. He loosened his silk tie and sat heavily in my leather armchair. He rubbed his face, looking appropriately haggard, but he made sure his solid gold Rolex was clearly visible on his wrist. He poured himself a glass of expensive scotch and began weaving a masterpiece of deception. Richard, he said, looking my father dead in the eye, I am so sorry my deranged ex-wife has brought this chaos to your doorstep. Jocelyn's malicious cyber attack has temporarily locked my assets. The auditors just need a few days to clear my name, but in the meantime, I am completely frozen out of my liquid cash. I need to post a $1 million bond by Friday to keep the federal investigators from seizing my business licenses. My father shifted uncomfortably. $1 million in cash was not something he kept lying around. He had a good retirement portfolio and a paid-off house, but pulling that kind of liquid capital required massive leveraging. Trent saw the hesitation and immediately dangled the bait he knew my parents could not resist. He brought up his mother. Helen was a formidable woman, born into generational old money wealth. My parents had spent the last 8 years desperately trying to secure invitations to Helen-exclusive charity galas and high society dinners. They craved that elite status. You both know about my mother. Massive generational trust fund. Trent continued leaning forward and lowering his voice as if sharing a corporate secret. That trust holds over $50 million in diversified assets. The only stipulation in my grandfather will was that the fund remains locked until I produce a biological heir. The second Brittany gives birth to those twins, that $50 million legally transfers to me. Trent reached out and grabbed my father's hand. I just need bridge capital, Richard. I need $1 million to survive Jocelyn a legal vendetta until the babies are born. Once the trust unlocks, I will pay you back $3 million for your trouble. You and Patricia will have full access to Helen Estate. We will summer together in Martha Vineyard. You will never have to worry about money again. My parents looked at each other. They were entirely blinded by the illusion of high society and the glittering promise of unearned wealth. They did not see a desperate criminal begging for bail money. They saw a golden ticket. Richard stood up and immediately called his private wealth manager. He bypassed all standard financial advice. Over the next 48 hours, my parents frantically pushed through paperwork to take out a massive second mortgage on the family home they had lived in for 30 years. They drained their high-yield savings accounts and cashed out their mutual funds, taking brutal early withdrawal penalties just to gather the cash. They truly believed they were rescuing a billionaire heir from a jealous baron's sister. They believed they were securing their place in the upper echelon of American wealth. By Thursday morning, the bank approved the second mortgage. Richard signed the final transfer authorization, sending $1 million in liquid cash directly into an offshore account Trent had provided. Patricia felt triumphant. She felt she had defeated me and protected her golden child. She could not resist the urge to gloat. I was sitting at my desk at the accounting firm reviewing a fresh batch of subpoenas when my phone vibrated. I unlocked the screen and opened a text message from my mother. The words were dripping with venom and misplaced pride. We saved Trent and your sister. Blood is thicker than your bitter jealousy. You tried to ruin them because you are empty inside, but you failed. Leave us alone. I read the message twice. I did not feel an ounce of anger or sadness. I felt the cold, clinical satisfaction of a hunter watching the trap snap shut. They had not saved Trent. They had willingly wired $1 million to a man currently under federal investigation for wire fraud and money laundering. They had just thrown their entire life savings into a burning building. I took a screenshot of my mother's text message. I opened a new message thread and attached the image. I typed out a quick response and hit send, forwarding the entire exchange directly to DeAndre. They just funded a federal crime. The conference room at the downtown Chicago Mediation Center smelled of lemon polish and expensive leather. I sat beside DeAndre at the long mahogany table, my hands resting lightly on the cool surface. We had been waiting for 10 minutes. The heavy glass door finally swung open, and Trent strolled in, radiating the obnoxious, unearned confidence of a man who had just scammed $1 million in liquid cash from my gullible parents. Brittany was practically glued to his side. She wore a pristine white maternity dress that clung tightly to her swelling stomach, clutching a new beige Chanel purse. Trent had apparently wasted no time tapping into my parents' stolen retirement funds to keep her dripping in luxury. Right behind them was Trent's new legal counsel, a slick, overworked attorney named Vance Sterling, who looked like he billed $1,000 an hour just to breathe. Vance did not waste time with pleasantries. He unclasped his briefcase, pulled out a thick stack of demands, and slapped them onto the table. We are here to establish a fair and equitable division of assets, Vance announced, adjusting his silk tie. My client has suffered severe emotional and financial distress due to the malicious freezing of his personal accounts. We are officially demanding 50% ownership of Jocelyn Forensic Accounting Firm, a monthly spousal support stipend of $40,000, and the immediate transfer of the Hamptons property debt back to your client. Trent is accustomed to a certain lifestyle, and as the higher earner during the marriage, Jocelyn is obligated to maintain it. Trent leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms behind his head. He looked at me with an arrogant, condescending smirk. "You really thought you could starve me out, Jocelyn," he sneered. "You thought locking my bank accounts would break me. But I am fully liquid again. You are going to pay for my legal fees, my housing, and my children. You are going to finance my new life." Brittany placed a manicured hand over her belly, jutting her chin out defensively. "The stress you have put us under is practically criminal, Jocelyn. My doctor says my pregnancy is high risk because of your bitter jealousy. The least you can do is sign the papers and let Trent support his real family." I did not blink. I did not raise my voice. I simply turned my head and nodded at DeAndre. DeAndre reached into his sleek leather briefcase. He did not pull out a standard legal rebuttal. He pulled out a heavy 50-page bound dossier and slid it slowly across the polished mahogany table. It stopped precisely in front of Vance Sterling. "That is not a counteroffer." DeAndre stated, his voice a smooth, lethal baritone that instantly commanded the room. "That is a forensic financial audit. My client mapped every single transaction your client has made over the past 24 months. Vance frowned, flipping open the heavy cover of the dossier. His eyes began to scan the first page. Almost immediately, the color completely drained from his face. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table and locking my gaze onto Trent. "You are not getting a dime of my firm, Trent. You are not getting spousal support. Because as of yesterday afternoon, you no longer have a job." Trent dropped his arms from behind his head. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his arrogant smirk faltering. I turned to page 12 of my own copy of the dossier and read the highlighted text aloud. "On November 14th, you purchased a $35,000 Himalayan Birkin bag for my sister. You routed the payment through a dummy vendor account and billed it to Vanguard Financial as server maintenance upgrades. On January 2nd, you authorized a $40,000 wire transfer to a private jet charter company for a romantic getaway to St. Bart's. You coded it as Executive Team Building Retreat on your corporate ledger." I flipped the page, the crisp sound echoing in the silent room. "You did not just lose $5 million of your own money in cryptocurrency margin calls, Trent. You actively embezzled over $400,000 in company funds from Vanguard Financial to buy designer bags, luxury watches, and lavish vacations for your mistress." Brittany let out a sharp gasp, her hand flying to her mouth as she stared at Trent in horror. The beige Chanel bag slipped from her lap and hit the floor with a dull thud. Vance Sterling slammed the dossier shut and shoved his chair back from the table. He turned to Trent, his eyes wide with furious panic. "You told me this was a standard asset dispute," Vance hissed. "You never mentioned corporate embezzlement. You are actively under federal investigation. I cannot represent you in a criminal fraud case." "Sit down," Vance Trent barked, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. "She is lying. She fabricated these documents because she is a bitter, barren woman who cannot handle the fact that I left her." DeAndre smiled, a cold, predatory flash of white teeth. "The federal agents who raided the Vanguard Financial headquarters this morning did not think she was lying, Trent. They have your hard drives. They have your forged vendor invoices." Jocelyn simply handed them the map. Trent sprang up from his chair, slamming his palms flat against the mahogany table. The veins in his neck bulged as he glared down at me. His pristine corporate facade completely disintegrated, leaving only a cornered, desperate animal. He realized his new lawyer was packing his briefcase to abandon him, and his pregnant girlfriend was shrinking away from him in sheer terror. "You think you have won?" Trent snarled, his voice echoing loudly off the glass walls of the conference room. "You think this little audit is going to stop me? You are nothing, Jocelyn. You are a lonely, pathetic accountant. My mother trust fund unlocks next month when the twins are born. $50 million. I will buy the best defense attorneys in the country. I will tie you up in court for the next decade. I will bury you both in litigation until you are begging me for mercy." I looked up at the sweating, furious man I had once called my husband. I did not flinch at his threats. I did not shrink away from his anger. I just sat back in my chair, looked at his panicked, trembling hands, and smiled coldly. The cold smile on my face was the last thing Trent saw before he snatched his leather briefcase and stormed out of the glass-walled conference room. His expensive shoes slammed against the floor tiles, echoing his complete lack of control. Vance Sterling did not follow him. Instead, Trent's soon-to-be former attorney sat with his head in his hands, contemplating the ethical disaster his client had just dragged him into. DeAndre calmly gathered our files and we walked out, leaving the wreckage behind us. The fallout from the mediation was swift, but the real danger was brewing in a completely different part of the city. The very next morning, a heavy cream-colored envelope was hand-delivered to my office by a private courier. It bore the unmistakable wax seal of the Thornton family. Helen Thornton did not send text messages or emails when she meant business. She summoned people. The brief, elegant cursive requested my immediate presence at her estate. At 68 years old, Helen was the undisputed matriarch of the Thornton Empire. She possessed a sharp, calculating intelligence that her son had completely failed to inherit. While Trent played at being a financial genius, Helen actually controlled the generational wealth that funded his illusions. I drove through the towering wrought iron gates of the Thornton estate later that afternoon. The sweeping driveway was lined with centuries-old oak trees, leading up to a massive stone mansion that radiated quiet, unyielding power. A silent housekeeper led me through the marble foyer and into the sunlit conservatory where Helen was waiting. She sat straight-backed in a high-winged chair, an intricate porcelain teacup resting in her manicured hands. She did not look like a woman preparing to welcome new grandchildren. She looked like a general assessing a battlefield. "Sit down, Jocelyn," Helen commanded, her piercing gray eyes locking onto mine. I took the seat opposite her, resting my handbag on the floor. Helen did not bother with pleasantries or small talk. She set her teacup down with a sharp clink against the saucer. "My son called me yesterday in a state of absolute hysteria," Helen began, her voice smooth but laced with dangerous authority. "He claims you have launched a malicious cyber attack against him. He says you manufactured millions of dollars in debt out of pure jealousy because his new girlfriend is pregnant with the Thornton heirs. He expects me to advance his inheritance to fight you in federal court." I remained perfectly still, keeping my posture relaxed and my expression neutral. "And what do you believe, Helen?" "I believe my son is an idiot," Helen replied without a second of hesitation. "Trent is prone to reckless exaggeration, and he has always been terrified of your intellect. I also know you, Jocelyn. You are a senior forensic accountant. You do not throw tantrums. You calculate. You strategize. You do not surrender valuable real estate and walk away from a 10-year marriage without a fight, unless you are holding a winning hand." She leaned forward, her sharp gaze dissecting my calm demeanor. "You handed him the Hamptons house on a silver platter. You walked out of mediation smiling. Something is very wrong, and I want to know exactly what kind of mess my son has dragged this family into." I looked at the formidable woman across from me. For a brief moment, I almost felt a flicker of sympathy for her. She had spent her entire life protecting the Thornton legacy, only to have her son risk it all on a cheap affair and a mountain of fraudulent crypto debt. But I had my own game to play, and I was not going to break my legal obligations to do it. "I respect you, Helen," I said, my tone matching her serious pitch. "But you know I cannot discuss the specifics of Trent financial liabilities right now. The federal investigators have that well in hand. However, there is another matter, a much more personal one." Helen narrowed her eyes. "Trent told me the trust fund unlocks next month when Brittany gives birth. He is banking everything on those twins securing his access to $50 million. I let out a slow, measured breath. 5 years ago, Trent and I spent months sitting in sterile clinic waiting rooms. We underwent countless invasive tests when we were trying to start a family. When the final results came back, Trent was devastated. His pride was completely shattered. He could not stomach the idea of anyone in his elite social circle knowing the truth. "What truth?" Helen demanded, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "He brought a legal document to our kitchen table." I continued, keeping my eyes locked on hers. He refused to even discuss alternative options like adoption or donors until I signed it. It was a binding medical non-disclosure agreement drafted by his corporate lawyers. I was legally barred from ever discussing his biological fertility test results with anyone, including his own mother. I signed it because I loved him and I wanted to protect his fragile ego. Helen's face went completely still. The silence in the conservatory grew heavy and suffocating. She was a brilliant woman, and it did not take long for the pieces to snap into place in her mind. If Trent required an absolute gag order regarding his fertility, it meant the problem was entirely his. It meant he was completely sterile. I am a professional. Helen, I said, breaking the silence. I do not breach contracts, and I do not violate non-disclosure agreements. I will not speak a single word about Trent medical history. I stood up and smoothed the front of my tailored skirt. You should ask your son about his bloodline, Helen. I kept my promise. I did not wait for a response. I turned and walked out of the conservatory, leaving the matriarch of the Thornton Empire sitting in the profound, deafening silence of her own realization. Helen did not scream. She did not cry. As I walked down the marble hallway, I heard the distinct sound of her picking up the heavy antique telephone receiver from her desk. Her voice echoed slightly, carrying the lethal precision of a woman who had just realized her legacy was being hijacked by a gold-digging fraud. "Connect me to my son, Helen," instructed her assistant, her tone as cold as liquid nitrogen. "And clear my schedule for this weekend. I want to host a grand celebratory family dinner for Trent and his lovely new girlfriend. Send an invitation to Richard and Patricia as well. It is time we all sat down together to celebrate the future of this family." The heavy glass of the goblet shattered against the imported Italian marble, sending a spray of dark liquid across the pristine floor. The sharp, violent crack of the crystal breaking echoed through the cavernous living room like a gunshot. My parents jumped back, Patricia letting out a startled yelp as a few drops of the dark liquid splashed against her designer shoes. Trent froze, his hand still extended outward in his arrogant demand for the $50 million. Brittany took a quick, terrified step backward, her hands flying to protect her pregnant belly. Helen did not look down at the mess she had just made. She did not flinch at the sound of the shattering glass. She slowly pushed herself up from the velvet armchair, her posture rigid, her face devoid of any trace of maternal warmth. She looked like a judge preparing to deliver a death sentence. "Trent," my father said, his voice trembling as he tried to diffuse the sudden terrifying shift in the room's energy. "Helen, please. The maids can clean that up. We are here to celebrate. Trent has finally given you the heirs you wanted. The trust." "Shut your mouth, Richard." Helen snapped, her voice cracking like a whip. She did not even look at my father. Her furious, burning gaze was locked entirely on Trent. Trent swallowed hard, a bead of sweat forming at his temple. "Mother, what is wrong with you?" he demanded, trying to force his tone to remain dominant. "I just handed you everything you ever demanded. I secured the bloodline. Brittany is carrying your grandchildren. We need the trust documents finalized today." Helen took a slow, deliberate step toward her son. The crunch of broken crystal under her designer heel was the only sound in the room. She held up the crumpled ultrasound photo, her hand shaking with a terrifying, suppressed rage. "My grandchildren," Helen whispered, her voice dropping to a lethal, quiet hiss. "You bring this woman into my home. You parade her in front of me, demanding access to my family legacy, and you dare to call these parasites my grandchildren." Brittany gasped, her face turning a deep, blotchy red. "Excuse me!" she cried out, her voice shrill with indignation. "How dare you speak about my babies that way? Trent is their father. They are the heirs to this family." Helen turned her gaze to Brittany, looking at her as if she were a particularly repulsive insect that had crawled onto her expensive rug. "You naive, greedy little fool," Helen said coldly. "You really thought you hit the jackpot, did you not? You thought you could trap my son with a pregnancy and secure a $50 million payout. You thought you could play high society with my money." Helen turned back to Trent. The absolute disgust radiating from her was palpable. She threw the crumpled ultrasound photo directly at his chest. It fluttered to the floor, landing in the puddle of spilled liquid. "Tell her," Trent Helen commanded, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "Tell your cheap mistress exactly why that $50 million trust fund will remain locked forever. Tell her why those children cannot possibly carry our name." Trent stumbled backward, his face draining of all color. He looked like the floor had suddenly vanished beneath him. "Mother, stop!" he pleaded, his voice cracking into a pathetic, desperate whine. "Do not do this. Not here. I can explain everything." "Explain what?" Trent Helen yelled, her composure finally breaking. "Explain how you expect to inherit a biological trust fund when you are entirely sterile." The silence that followed was absolute and deafening. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the room. Brittany's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She stared at Trent, her eyes wide with a horrified, dawning realization. Patricia and Richard stood frozen, their faces slack with shock. The $1 million they had just wired to Trent's offshore account suddenly felt very heavy and very lost. "What did you just say?" Brittany whispered, her voice trembling violently. Helen did not break eye contact with Trent. "2 years ago, my son underwent a major surgical procedure for a severe varicocele." Helen explained, her voice ringing with brutal clarity. "The complication required a full, irreversible vasectomy. I paid the top urological surgeons in the country to ensure his health. He is medically, biologically, and permanently incapable of fathering a child." Helen stepped closer to Trent, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "So tell me, Trent, who exactly is the father of the babies your mistress is carrying? Because it certainly is not you." Brittany staggered backward, hitting the wall. She clutched her stomach, her breath coming in ragged, hyperventilating gasps. She looked at Trent, waiting for him to deny it, waiting for him to call his mother crazy. But Trent could not speak. He was staring at the floor, his entire body shaking, the ultimate fraud, finally exposed to the harsh light of reality. "Trent!" Brittany shrieked, her voice echoing with pure panic. "Trent, tell her she is lying. Tell her these are your babies." Trent slowly raised his head. He looked at Brittany, then at my parents, and finally at his mother. The silence stretched heavy and condemning. He had nothing left. The corporate facade, the illusion of wealth, the lies he had spun to trap Brittany and rob my parents. It had all collapsed in a single devastating moment. My parents realized simultaneously that they had mortgaged their home and drained their retirement for a lie. Patricia let out a strangled, horrifying wail and collapsed onto the sofa. Richard grabbed his chest, his face turning an alarming shade of gray as the reality of their complete financial ruin settled over him. Helen turned her back on her son, adjusting her immaculate jacket. "Get out of my house," she said, her voice dripping with finality. "All of you. You are dead to me, Trent. You will not receive a single dime from this family, ever again." Trent opened his mouth to beg, but the piercing wail of police sirens suddenly erupted outside, growing louder and louder as multiple federal vehicles tore up the long, sweeping driveway. The heavy oak doors of the Thornton estate swung open, revealing an interior that practically suffocated visitors with centuries of old money. Intricate Persian rugs lined the marble floors, antique crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, and enormous oil portraits of stern-faced ancestors stared down from the mahogany-paneled walls. Trent strode into the grand drawing room as if he owned the entire universe. He radiated the obnoxious, unearned triumph of a man who believed he had just checkmated everyone in his life. He puffed out his chest, adjusting his tailored suit jacket, and proudly guided Brittany forward by the small of her back. Brittany wore a disgustingly expensive white maternity gown, her hand resting delicately on her swelling stomach. She looked around the opulent room with wide, greedy eyes, mentally redecorating the estate she believed she was about to inherit. Trailing closely behind them were Richard and Patricia. My parents practically vibrated with desperate anticipation. They looked at the lavish surroundings, the priceless art, and the gilded moldings, calculating their massive return on investment. They had happily committed federal fraud and drained their entire life savings to bail out this golden boy, completely blinded by the glittering promise of unearned wealth and summer homes in Martha Vineyard. Helen Thornton sat perfectly still in a high-backed velvet armchair near the massive stone fireplace. She held a priceless hand-painted Ming Dynasty teacup resting on a delicate saucer. She did not rise to greet them. She simply extended one manicured hand, her piercing gray eyes fixed intensely on the young woman carrying her supposed grandchildren. Trent beamed, snapping his fingers. Brittany eagerly reached into her designer bag, pulled out a strip of glossy black and white ultrasound photos, and placed them delicately into Helen's extended hand. Mother Jocelyn was a barren, broken woman, Trent announced, his voice booming with arrogant authority. Brittany is giving you the heirs you always wanted. The bloodline is secure. It is time to unlock the generational trust. Helen did not respond. She stared down at the grainy images of the developing twins. The silence in the massive drawing room stretched out, growing thick and profoundly uncomfortable. Trent's smug, victorious smile began to waver at the edges. Richard and Patricia shifted awkwardly on the Persian rug, exchanging nervous glances. Helen's hands began to tremble. The tremors started in her fingertips and traveled violently up her forearms. The priceless porcelain teacup slipped from her grip. It hit the unforgiving marble floor, exploding into 100 jagged painted fragments. Hot tea splattered violently across the pristine stone and onto Trent-polished Italian leather shoes. Helen did not look down at the shattered heirloom. She did not flinch at the sharp, violent crack. The color rapidly drained from her face, leaving her skin an ashen, sickly shade of gray. She looked at the ultrasound photos clutched in her shaking hand, then slowly raised her eyes to Trent. She looked at Brittany, assessing the young woman, calculated, nervous posture. Finally, her piercing gaze snapped back to her son. The room went completely, terrifyingly dead silent. "Wait," Helen breathed. Her voice was entirely stripped of its usual booming, aristocratic authority. It dropped into a lethal, horrified whisper that somehow echoed in every corner of the massive room. "She did not tell you." Trent blinked, stepping backward as his golden boy facade deflated. He looked at Brittany, then back at his mother, genuine confusion twisting his features. "Tell me what?" Helen completely crumbled. The ironclad matriarch of the Thornton Empire broke down in a volatile, terrifying mixture of pure rage and absolute horror. She pushed herself up from the velvet chair and stepped forward, slamming the glossy ultrasound photos directly against Trent's chest. "When you had complications from the mumps at age 14, Helen shrieked, her voice cracking with decades of buried secrets. The fever nearly killed you. You became 100% sterile. You have no viable swimmers, Trent." Trent stopped breathing. His hands fell numbly to his sides as the ultrasound photos fluttered to the marble floor, landing in the puddle of spilled tea. "I hid the medical file to protect you," Helen sobbed, her pristine composure entirely destroyed by the devastating reality of her son's profound ignorance. "I paid off the pediatric specialists. I buried the truth because I wanted to protect your future. I wanted to protect your fragile male ego from feeling inadequate in a world that demands perfection." Helen pointed a violently shaking finger at the air, her face twisted in agonizing grief. "Jocelyn found out 8 years ago during your fertility screenings. She accessed the archived medical records. But she loved you so blindly that she took the blame for being barren to protect your pride. She let this entire family mock her. She let you call her broken." Helen turned her furious, tear-filled eyes toward Brittany. "So if you are biologically incapable of reproducing," Helen yelled, her voice tearing through the silence with lethal finality, "those twins are not yours." The words hit the room like a tactical strike. Patricia let out a strangled, horrifying gasp, her hands flying to cover her mouth. Richard's jaw dropped, his eyes darting frantically between Helen and Trent. In a single devastating second, my parents realized the horrifying truth. The $1 million they had just wired to an offshore account was gone. They had betrayed their own daughter, mortgaged their home, and ruined their entire lives to buy into a biological impossibility. Richard grabbed his chest, his face turning an alarming shade of red as the sheer gravity of their financial ruin crushed the air out of his lungs. The entire world seemed to tilt on its axis. The luxurious room, the $50 million trust fund, the ultimate victory. Trent thought he had won it all, turned to dust in his mouth. He realized why I had smiled so coldly at the mediation table. He realized why I had handed over the house and walked away without a fight. I knew. I had always known. He had sacrificed his marriage, his career, and his freedom for a phantom legacy. Trent slowly, mechanically turned his head. The arrogant corporate executive was dead. What remained was a cornered, humiliated, and highly dangerous predator. He fixed a slow, murderous gaze upon the woman standing beside him. Brittany facade dropped entirely. She backed away, hitting the mahogany-paneled wall. She was hyperventilating, her chest heaving in ragged, desperate gasps. She clutched her beige Chanel bag in front of her swelling stomach like a useless, pathetic shield. Tears of absolute panic streamed down her face. She opened her mouth to speak, to lie, to spin another web of deception, but only a high-pitched whimper escaped her trembling lips. Trent took a single heavy step toward her, his hands clenched into tight white-knuckled fists at his sides. The silence stretched thick with impending violence. "Then whose are they?" Trent asked. Trent stood paralyzed in the center of the ruined drawing room. The deafening wail of federal sirens pierced through the thick glass windows, but Trent did not seem to hear them. His eyes were locked on Brittany. His voice was a ragged, guttural demand. "Then whose are they?" Brittany pressed herself flat against the mahogany paneling. Her hands scrambled over her pregnant stomach as she hyperventilated. She looked like a trapped rat desperately searching for a lie that could save her. She found nothing. Before she could utter a single pathetic excuse, the heavy double doors leading to Helen's private study clicked open. The sharp sound drew every eye in the room. I stepped through the doorway, my posture perfectly straight, my expression entirely serene. DeAndre walked right beside me, his bespoke suit, immaculate, radiating absolute predatory control. Helen had kept us waiting in the study, orchestrating the timing of our entrance for maximum devastation. Trent's jaw dropped. Richard and Patricia stared at me as if they were looking at a ghost. DeAndre did not offer a polite greeting. He stepped over the shattered remains of Helen's priceless porcelain teacup, reached into his leather briefcase, and pulled out a thick medical file. He tossed it casually onto the center of the mahogany coffee table. It landed with a heavy, authoritative slap that made Brittany flinch. "She did not cheat on you, Trent," I stated, my voice echoing smoothly across the cavernous room. "At least not in the traditional sense." Trent looked from me to the file on the table, his chest heaving. "What is that?" "That is a forensic paper trail," DeAndre explained, his rich baritone voice filling the space. "We traced several highly unusual charges on a secret credit card your girlfriend opened under a maiden name." I took a slow, deliberate step forward. Brittany realized her grip on her stolen luxury lifestyle was slipping, I said, keeping my eyes locked on my sister. She was furious that she was losing DeAndre. She had spent months trying to manipulate my own attorney, desperately attempting to sabotage my legal counsel through back-channel seductions and bribes. When DeAndre completely shut her down and systematically dismantled her legal leverage, she panicked. She knew her cash flow was ending. She needed to trap you permanently for your perceived wealth. She needed the Thornton generational trust. Trent stared at Brittany, his face twisting into a mask of pure revulsion. "Open the file," DeAndre commanded. Trent's hands shook violently as he reached down and flipped open the manila cover. His eyes scanned the highlighted bank statements and clinic receipts. $60,000, I clarified, watching the absolute horror wash over Trent's face. Wired directly to the Genesis Elite Fertility Clinic in Manhattan. She purchased premium anonymous donor sperm. She underwent rapid IVF treatments, while you were conveniently away on your fabricated executive retreats. She knew you would never question a sudden pregnancy. She weaponized your massive ego, knowing you would simply assume a biological miracle had occurred. She played you for a fool to steal $50 million. Brittany let out a loud, ugly sob, sliding down the wall until she hit the floor. "Trent," she wailed, her hands reaching out toward him. "I did it for us. We needed the money. I just wanted to give you the family you deserved." Trent violently kicked the coffee table, sending the file flying across the room. "Do not touch me," he roared, backing away from her as if she were carrying a plague. "You parasitic, lying fraud." I turned my gaze away from the imploding couple and looked directly at my parents. Richard and Patricia were clutching each other in the center of the room. The golden child illusion they had worshipped for 30 years was entirely, irreparably shattered. Patricia's mouth opened and closed silently, her eyes darting frantically between Brittany's sobbing form and the medical receipts scattered across the Persian rug. Richard was sweating profusely, his hand gripping his chest as his breathing grew shallow and erratic. "I hope the illusion of high society was worth it," I said to my parents, my voice devoid of any pity or warmth. "You mortgaged the family home. You drained your entire life savings. You took massive, brutal early withdrawal penalties on your retirement accounts. You bypassed every single financial safeguard because you were so blinded by greed and your desperate need to feel superior to me." Patricia let out a high, thin keen of despair. "Jocelyn, please," she begged, tears spilling over her expensive makeup. "We did not know. We were just trying to help your sister." "You wired $1 million in liquid cash to a criminal offshore account." I continued my words, striking them like physical blows. "You funded a man who is actively under federal investigation for corporate embezzlement. And you did it to support a daughter who is carrying anonymous donor babies to commit trust fund fraud. You threw away everything you spent your entire lives building for a sterile broke man and a pathological liar." Richard's legs finally gave out. He collapsed heavily into a chair, burying his face in his hands, as a wretched sob tore from his throat. The reality of their complete, irreversible financial ruin had fully settled in. They had nothing left. No retirement, no house, no elite status, and absolutely no way to recover the funds they had willingly wired to a criminal. Helen stood silently by the fireplace, her face a mask of cold satisfaction. She looked at the pathetic display of my family and her ruined son, entirely unbothered by their destruction. She had protected her empire and she had used me to do it. Outside the mansion, the deafening wail of sirens suddenly cut out. The harsh, erratic flashes of red and blue lights illuminated the sheer curtains of the grand drawing room. Heavy footsteps pounded against the stone steps of the front porch, followed by the loud, authoritative pounding of federal agents at the front door. Trent froze, his eyes darting toward the entryway. The trap had closed completely and there was no way out. Helen did not scream. She did not throw another priceless object or raise her voice to compete with the wailing federal sirens echoing outside the gates. Instead, she radiated a terrifying, icy calm that paralyzed every single person in the room. She reached into the pocket of her tailored blazer, extracted her smartphone, and tapped a single contact. The room was so profoundly quiet that the ringing of the speakerphone echoed sharply off the vaulted ceilings and mahogany paneling. "Arthur," Helen commanded the moment the line connected. "Execute the moral turpitude and fraud clauses on Trent Trust. I want an immediate and total severance." The crisp, professional voice of the Thornton family estate lawyer filled the silent room. "Total severance, Helen. Are you absolutely certain?" "I am looking at a forensic paper trail of intentional fraud, biological deception, and criminal embezzlement." Helen stated, her tone dropping to absolute zero. "My son is officially severed from the Thornton Family Trust effective this very second. Cancel all his premium credit lines, freeze the domestic and offshore accounts, revoke his access to the corporate jet, the Martha Vineyard property, and the penthouse. He gets absolutely nothing." Trent fell to his knees. The sickening thud of his kneecaps hitting the hard marble floor was the only sound besides the lawyer calmly confirming the orders. "Mother, no," Trent begged. His voice was a pathetic, high-pitched whine, completely stripped of its usual arrogant bravado. "You cannot do this to me. I am your only son. I am the future of this family." "I have no son," Helen replied, ending the call with a sharp, dismissive tap of her finger. She looked down at him, her expression devoid of any trace of maternal warmth or hesitation. "You are a parasite. You genuinely thought you could outsmart me with a fake clinic receipt and a cheap, lying mistress. You thought you could steal my legacy. You are entirely erased from this bloodline." Helen slowly turned her formidable gaze away from the pathetic wreckage of her son and locked eyes with me. I stood tall next to DeAndre, my posture straight, meeting her stare without a single flinch. Beside me, I could hear my mother Patricia taking short, hyperventilating gasps. Patricia and Richard were watching their entire universe violently crumble. They were finally realizing that the daughter they had so easily discarded, the daughter they had actively plotted against and tried to destroy, was standing firmly on the winning side of the battlefield. Helen walked slowly toward me. Her heels clicked with lethal precision against the marble. Jocelyn. Helen said, her voice softening just a fraction, though it remained heavy with absolute authority. You stood by my son. You protected his dignity for 8 years while he actively spit on yours. You let high society whisper about you. You let your own wretched, greedy parents look down on you all to shield a man who never deserved a fraction of your loyalty or your grace. I did not break eye contact. I honored my vows, I replied simply, even when he did not. Helen nodded, a gesture of profound, ultimate respect from a woman who respected virtually no one. And because of that integrity, you are the only person in this room I trust. Helen reached into her blazer and pulled out a heavy cream-colored envelope bearing the golden Thornton crest. She held it out to me. I am entirely restructuring the Thornton empire. Effective immediately, I am naming your firm the sole executor of my estate. The collective gasp from my parents was pure music to my ears. Richard's face turned a dangerous, blotchy shade of purple. Patricia let out a strangled, horrifying cry, her manicured hands clawing at her pearl necklace, as if the jewels were suddenly choking her. They had destroyed their own lives. They had committed federal wire fraud and permanently alienated their only loyal child, all to secure a piece of the Thornton wealth. Now Helen had just handed the keys to the entire kingdom directly to me. I was the gatekeeper. I was the one who would oversee the billions they had sacrificed their freedom and their souls to steal. Trent stayed on his knees for a long, agonizing moment. His world had imploded. He looked at me holding the envelope containing his birthright. He looked at his mother turning her back on him with total disgust. He looked at my parents who were sobbing and clutching their chests in complete financial ruin. And then his frantic, bloodshot eyes locked onto Brittany. Brittany was still pinned against the mahogany wall, clutching her stomach. Her face was stained with black mascara and terrified tears. She had used his desperate, fragile ego against him. She had purchased anonymous donor sperm to secure her own luxury lifestyle, effectively sealing his doom and exposing his greatest shame to the entire room. Something inside Trent completely and violently snapped. The polished executive, the arrogant golden boy who always had a witty remark, vanished. What remained was a cornered, rabid animal acting on pure destructive instinct. A guttural roar tore from his throat. He scrambled up from the marble floor and lunged directly at Brittany, his hands outstretched like claws aiming straight for her throat. Brittany shrieked in terror, throwing her arms over her face and sinking toward the floor. But Trent never reached her. Before Trent could close the distance, DeAndre moved. He was a blur of calculated, devastating motion. DeAndre intercepted Trent mid-lunge, grabbing the lapels of Trent-tailored suit. With a fluid, terrifying display of physical dominance, DeAndre spun Trent around and slammed him face first onto the heavy oak dining table. The brutal impact rattled the antique crystal glasses and sent sterling silverware crashing to the floor. DeAndre pinned Trent's arms painfully behind his back. He pressed his forearm securely against the back of Trent's neck, locking him immovably against the polished wood. Trent thrashed and screamed, spitting curses and kicking his legs, but DeAndre held him down with effortless, terrifying strength. "Assaulting a pregnant woman?" DeAndre said, his deep voice perfectly calm, leaning down so his words echoed directly into Trent's ear. "That is another felony, Trent, and considering the federal agents waiting just outside those doors, I highly suggest you stop moving." DeAndre held Trent effortlessly against the mahogany table. The massive oak doors of the drawing room burst open. 3 federal agents wearing dark tactical windbreakers stormed into the room, their badges gleaming under the crystal chandeliers. They were flanked by 2 of Helen's towering private estate security guards. The trap had not just closed, it had completely locked. "Trenton Thornton," the lead agent barked, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit financial extortion." DeAndre stepped back casually, adjusting his bespoke cuffs as the federal agents hauled Trent off the table. They slammed him against the wall and violently wrenched his arms behind his back. The sharp, heavy click of steel handcuffs snapping shut echoed like a gunshot. Trent fought against the grip, his face twisted into an ugly, pathetic mask of pure panic. "Mother, do something!" Trent screamed, his voice breaking into a hysterical sob. "You cannot let them take me out like this. I am your son." Helen remained entirely motionless in her high-backed velvet chair. She slowly smoothed a non-existent wrinkle from her tailored blazer. "Take this criminal out of my sight," she ordered the agents, completely ignoring Trent's desperate, pleading eyes. "He is trespassing on Thornton property." The agents dragged Trent backward across the priceless Persian rugs. He kicked and thrashed, screaming obscenities at Helen, at DeAndre, and finally at Brittany. His golden boy facade was entirely eradicated, replaced by the raving tantrums of a ruined, pathetic fraud. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind them, cutting off his frantic screams. The massive drawing room fell into a suffocating, heavy silence. Brittany remained crumpled on the marble floor. Her expensive maternity gown was soaked in spilled tea, and her carefully styled hair clung to her damp, tear-stained face in miserable clumps. She stared at the closed oak doors, her mouth opening and closing silently. The $50 million trust fund was gone. The luxurious estate was gone. The man she had manipulated into securing her high society future was currently being shoved into the back of a federal vehicle. She had nothing left but clinic debt and a pair of fatherless twins. Trembling violently, Brittany slowly turned her head toward the only safety net she had ever known. She looked up at Richard and Patricia. Her entire life they had bailed her out. They had rewarded her mediocrity, praised her deceit, and handed her everything she demanded on a silver platter. "Mom?" Brittany whimpered, her voice cracking as she extended a shaking hand toward Patricia. "Dad, you have to help me. I have nothing. How am I going to pay the clinic bills? Where am I going to live?" Patricia stared down at her youngest daughter. For 30 years, Patricia had worshipped the ground Brittany walked on. Now Patricia looked at her as if she were a diseased, rotting carcass. "Help you!" Patricia whispered, her voice vibrating with a terrifying, unhinged fury. "You want us to help you." Richard's face morphed into a mask of absolute violent hatred. He took a menacing step toward his former golden child. "You stupid, greedy, worthless parasite!" Richard roared, his voice shaking the crystal chandeliers above them. "We wired $1 million to a federal criminal because of you. We mortgaged the house. We drained our retirement accounts. We committed bank fraud to fund your pathetic lying scheme. We are completely ruined." "But I am your daughter," Brittany sobbed, clutching her pregnant stomach defensively. "You have to take care of me." "You are nothing!" Patricia shrieked, her aristocratic composure completely shattering. "You are a fraud. You cost us everything. Do not ever speak to us again." Richard and Patricia backed away from Brittany, leaving her sobbing alone in a puddle of tea and ruined ultrasound photos. Their chest heaved with panic as the reality of their destitute future crashed down upon them. The bank would foreclose on their home within weeks. The federal investigators would likely seize whatever remaining assets they had left to recover the wired funds. They were staring down the barrel of absolute poverty. Then Patricia, desperate, bloodshot eyes locked onto me. I was standing tall beside DeAndre, the heavy cream-colored envelope containing the keys to the entire Thornton empire resting securely in my hands. Helen had just named my firm the sole executor of her estate. I possessed more power, wealth, and influence in my left hand than my parents had ever seen in their entire lives. The pivot was immediate, shameless, and absolutely sickening. Patricia's face instantly smoothed out. The vicious, screaming harpy vanished, replaced by a desperate, fawning caricature of a loving mother. She rushed across the room, her hands reaching out toward me as if she wanted to pull me into a warm embrace. Richard followed closely behind her, his posture hunched in a pathetic display of submission. "Jocelyn, sweetie," Patricia pleaded, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. She stopped just a few feet away, deterred by the ice-cold glare DeAndre shot in her direction. Oh, Jocelyn, my brilliant, beautiful girl, we have made a terrible mistake. We were tricked. We were manipulated by your sister. She lied to us, Richard chimed in, nodding frantically. You know how she is, Jocelyn. She spun this massive web of deceit, and we were just trying to protect the family. But you see the truth now. You know we always believed in your firm. I looked at the two people who had raised me. I looked at the parents who had constantly degraded my career, mocked my marriage, and actively funded the sister who tried to destroy my life. Their desperation was a palpable foul stench in the air. You are the executor of the Thornton estate now. Patricia babbled, tears of pure panic streaming down her cheeks. She clasped her hands together in a begging motion. You have the power to fix this. You have the money, sweetie. You have to help us pay the mortgage back. If you do not write us a check today, the bank will take the house. We will be out on the street. You cannot let your own parents go homeless. I stood perfectly still. I did not yell. I did not scream. I did not validate their pathetic performance with anger. I simply let the silence stretch out, forcing them to drown in their own humiliating desperation. I looked at Richard, trembling hands. I looked at Patricia, ruined makeup. I looked at the utter destruction of the people who had treated me like a disposable stepping stone their entire lives. I felt absolutely nothing but cold, pure victory. I am sorry, Patricia, I said. My voice was smooth, quiet, and loaded with absolute lethal finality. Patricia's smile froze. I am just a barren, bitter woman. I continued, looking directly into her horrified eyes, feeding her exact vicious words back to her. I could not possibly help you. Richard opened his mouth to argue, but the sheer freezing authority in my gaze silenced him instantly. He realized in that exact moment that the daughter he had thrown away was the only one who could have saved him, and she was refusing to throw the life raft. I turned my back on my ruined family. I did not spare a single glance for Brittany sobbing on the floor, or my parents standing paralyzed in their own destruction. I nodded to Helen, who returned the gesture with a sharp, respectful tilt of her chin. DeAndre, I said, my voice ringing clearly through the grand drawing room. We are leaving. Right behind you, Madam Executor, DeAndre replied smoothly, adjusting his briefcase. We walked out of the massive oak doors, stepping out of the suffocating mansion, and into the bright, unclouded sunlight of my entirely new life. The crisp morning air tasted like pure victory as DeAndre and I descended the sprawling stone steps of the Thornton estate. Behind us, the muffled sounds of my parents' panicked sobbing were entirely drowned out by the revving engine of DeAndre's waiting town car. We did not speak as we slid into the leather seats. There was no need for empty chatter. The domestic skirmish was officially over. Now it was time to initiate the corporate bloodbath. I directed the driver to take us straight to the headquarters of my forensic accounting firm. For 8 years, I had played the quiet, supportive wife. I had smiled politely at corporate galas, while Trent paraded around pretending to be a financial titan. He truly believed his offshore crypto wallets and shell companies were invisible. He severely underestimated the woman who balanced his books every single night. Walking into my glass-paneled office, I felt a surge of lethal energy. My team of senior analysts was already assembled, waiting for my signal. I placed my encrypted hard drive on the center of the massive mahogany conference table. This drive contained every single fabricated ledger, every illegal wire transfer, and every deleted email Trent thought he had scrubbed from his firm's servers. He had been running a massive cryptocurrency Ponzi scheme, siphoning funds from his own high-net-worth clients to sustain his extravagant lifestyle and fund his fake empire. Compile the final dossier, I instructed my lead analyst. Do not leave a single decimal out of place. Cross-reference the offshore routing numbers with the dummy accounts he set up in the Caymans. Within 2 hours, we had a bulletproof 300-page forensic report. It detailed exactly how Trent had manipulated the blockchain transactions to hide his rampant embezzlement. I personally drafted the cover letter to the Securities and Exchange Commission. The federal agents who had just dragged Trent out of his mother drawing room only had half the puzzle. They arrested him on suspicion of domestic wire fraud based on the initial tip. The package I just submitted to the SEC guaranteed he would face a tidal wave of federal charges. I hit send and watched the delivery confirmation receipt pop up on my screen. Trent corporate grave was officially dug, and I had personally poured the heavy concrete over the lid. DeAndre sat across from my desk, sipping a glass of bourbon he had poured from my private stash. He watched me execute the final blow with a look of deep professional admiration. But DeAndre had his own loose ends to tie up. Brittany had ruined my marriage, but her betrayal of DeAndre was equally staggering. She was still legally married to him when she began her desperate campaign to trap Trent. She had bled DeAndre dry, draining their joint accounts to fund her designer wardrobe and maintain the illusion of independent wealth while secretly hunting for a bigger payout. "My turn," DeAndre said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He opened his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents bound in a severe blue folder. He had not just drafted standard divorce papers. DeAndre had orchestrated a legal masterpiece of absolute financial ruin. He filed a massive civil suit against Brittany for extreme financial fraud committed during their marriage. He had the bank records proving she had illegally diverted hundreds of thousands of dollars from his private accounts into secret trusts. And the most damning piece of evidence was the $60,000 wire transfer to the Genesis Elite Fertility Clinic. She had stolen her legal husband money to buy the anonymous donor sperm she used to secure her fake pregnancy with Trent. "I am filing this with the family court in exactly 1 hour," DeAndre stated, sliding a copy across my desk for me to read. "I have already petitioned the judge for an emergency freeze on every single asset associated with her social security number. She will not be able to buy a cup of coffee by noon. I am claiming absolute marital fraud. The prenuptial agreement she forced me to amend is completely null and void. She gets zero alimony. She gets zero assets. She walks away with exactly what she brought into this marriage, which is absolutely nothing." I read through the documents, marveling at the ruthless efficiency of his strike. Brittany had spent her entire life stepping on the necks of everyone around her, assuming she would never slip. She had mocked my supposed infertility. She had colluded with our parents to strip me of my dignity. Now she was staring down the barrel of crushing clinic debt, a massive civil lawsuit, and 2 fatherless twins she could not afford to feed. It was the exact definition of poetic justice. As DeAndre packed up his briefcase, my cell phone buzzed loudly on the glass desk. It was an alert from Instagram. I rarely use the app, but I had set a notification for Brittany account weeks ago, anticipating the inevitable fallout. Brittany had just gone live. I mirrored my phone screen to the large smart monitor on my office wall. DeAndre and I watched in absolute silence as the broadcast started. Brittany was sitting in the driver's seat of her leased Range Rover. The luxurious background of the Thornton estate was gone, replaced by the drab, cracked concrete of a strip mall parking lot. Her face was a complete disaster. The expensive makeup she had applied that morning was streaked with black mascara tears. Her hair was a tangled mess. She stared into the camera lens with wide, frantic eyes, watching the viewer count rapidly climb. 10,000, 50,000. Within minutes, over 100,000 people were watching her broadcast. She had spent years cultivating an audience of 500,000 followers by selling them a fake lifestyle of effortless wealth and beauty. Now she was using them as her final desperate lifeline. "Hey guys!" Brittany choked out a wet, theatrical sob tearing from her throat. "I really need to talk to you. I am in a highly dangerous situation right now and I need my community." She wiped her nose with the back of her hand, looking directly into the lens like a wounded animal. "My family has completely turned against me," she cried, her voice shaking with manufactured terror. "My sister Jocelyn and my ex DeAndre have teamed up to destroy my life out of pure jealousy. They are trying to steal my babies. They are trying to leave me homeless on the street. I have been financially abused and manipulated by the very people who were supposed to protect me." She paused, letting another perfectly timed tear roll down her cheek. The comments on the screen were flying by in a blur of shock and support from her clueless fans. "My own parents abandoned me," she wailed, gripping the leather steering wheel tightly. "I am pregnant and entirely alone, and they are trying to silence me. But I will not be silenced. I need you guys to know the real truth about what they did to me." Brittany stared into the camera, a picture of tragic victimhood, completely unaware that she was broadcasting her own execution. DeAndre leaned forward, resting his elbows on my glass desk, his eyes locked on the smart monitor. A slow, predatory smile spread across his face. He pulled his cell phone from his pocket and tapped a single button. On the monitor, Brittany was taking a dramatic, shaking breath, preparing to launch into her fabricated monologue about my supposed cruelty. She opened her mouth, but a sharp, authoritative knock on the driver's side window of her Range Rover made her jump. She spun around the camera, catching the sudden, genuine panic in her eyes. Outside her car stood a tall, broad-shouldered man in a gray suit, holding a thick stack of legal documents bound in a heavy blue folder. Brittany cracked the window just an inch, glaring at the man. "Excuse me. I am in the middle of a live broadcast to 500,000 people." She snapped, her victim persona vanishing for a split second to reveal the vicious entitlement underneath. The man did not flinch. He spoke loudly and clearly, ensuring his voice was perfectly picked up by her phone microphone. "Brittany, you are formally served on behalf of DeAndre. This is an immediate cease and desist order. You are also served with a civil lawsuit for marital financial fraud, grand larceny, and public defamation." He shoved the thick blue folder through the 1-inch crack in her window. It landed heavily in her lap, right on top of her designer maternity dress. "Have a terrible day," the process server added flatly, turning on his heel and walking away. In my office, DeAndre took a slow, satisfied sip of his bourbon. He had hired a private investigator to track her leased vehicle the moment she fled the Thornton estate. The timing was nothing short of cinematic perfection. On the screen, Brittany's face drained of all color. She stared at the legal documents in her lap as if they were a live grenade. The comment section on her live stream, which just seconds ago had been filled with heart emojis and messages of sympathy, suddenly froze. Then the chat exploded. The text scrolled by in an absolute blur. Viewers were demanding to know what the process server meant by financial fraud and grand larceny. They were asking why her ex-husband was suing her. The narrative she had spent years carefully curating was unraveling live in front of hundreds of thousands of people. She looked back at the camera, her hands shaking violently. "You guys," she stammered frantically, trying to shove the legal documents out of the camera frame. "This is exactly what I was talking about. This is harassment. DeAndre is obsessed with me, and he is trying to intimidate me with fake legal papers because he cannot stand that I moved on with a wealthier man." That was my cue. I turned back to my encrypted laptop. Brittany was relying on the fact that Trent crimes and her own biological deception were still private family secrets. She thought she could spin the narrative because she assumed I would play by the old rules of high society silence. She was wrong. I was no longer protecting anyone. I opened a secure, untraceable proxy server. I had already compiled a devastating digital press kit. It contained high-resolution scans of the $60,000 Genesis Elite fertility clinic receipts, proving she purchased anonymous donor sperm. It contained the unsealed bankruptcy filings and the SEC confirmation codes regarding Trent's massive cryptocurrency Ponzi scheme. I attached the bank records proving Brittany had embezzled money from DeAndre to fund her fake pregnancy. I selected the email addresses for the tip lines at TMZ, Page 6, The Wall Street Journal, and 5 of the largest celebrity gossip accounts on Instagram. I did not include a long message. The documents spoke for themselves. I hit send, blasting the absolute unvarnished truth to the media-hungry wolves. The digital slaughter was incredibly swift. Less than 5 minutes later, the major gossip accounts broke the story. They posted the clinic receipts and the SEC fraud filings directly to their feeds, tagging Brittany account. The internet operates at lightning speed, and her viewers brought the receipts straight into her live stream. I watched the smart monitor as Brittany attempted to cry again, begging her followers to send her money for a legal defense fund. But the chat had completely turned against her. "Wait. Trent is broke," read one comment that flashed across the screen. "She bought sperm. The twins are not even his," read another. "TMZ just posted the clinic receipts. She is a total scam artist." Brittany read the comments. Her jaw dropped open. Her eyes darted back and forth across the screen as she realized the entire world was currently downloading the exact proof of her deception. She let out a panicked, breathless gasp. No, she whispered, her hands flying to her face. No, 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 those are fake. Jocelyn forged those. My sister is a sociopath. But the avalanche had already started and it was crushing her in real time. A banner notification popped up at the top of her live stream. It was a direct comment pinned by the official account of Luna Bibe, a luxury maternity brand that paid Britney a massive monthly retainer. Luna Bibe official. In light of the severe fraud and grand larceny allegations unfolding, we are immediately terminating our brand partnership with Britney. We do not support financial abuse. Britney let out a high-pitched shriek as she read the comment. Wait, Luna Bibi, please. It is a misunderstanding, she begged, the screen completely abandoning her dignity. Seconds later, a premium organic baby food company dropped her in the chat. Then a boutique lifestyle brand announced they were severing ties and demanding their upfront payment back. Her sponsorships were dissolving in front of 500,000 witnesses. She was losing her entire income stream by the second. The viewer count at the top of the screen began to plummet. 500,000 dropped to 400,000, then 300,000. Her followers were not just leaving the live stream, they were actively unfollowing her account. The chat was nothing but an endless stream of clown emojis, trash can emojis, and the word fraud typed in all caps. She was no longer a glamorous society influencer. She was a national joke, a desperate scammer caught red-handed. Leave me alone, Britney screamed at the camera, her voice tearing into a hysterical, ugly screech. You are all just jealous haters. You do not know anything. She wildly slapped at her phone screen, fumbling with the buttons in her panic. The image froze on her tear-streaked, terrified face for one glorious second before the screen went entirely black. The live stream had ended. I sat back in my leather office chair and closed my laptop with a soft, satisfying click. I looked up at DeAndre. He raised his glass of bourbon in a silent toast. We had systematically dismantled her entire existence, and we had not even raised our voices to do it. 2 days after the live stream disaster, the final remnants of Richard and Patricia, fabricated reality, collapsed completely. The foreclosure notice arrived by certified mail. It was a thick, legally binding packet that landed on their imported kitchen island with a heavy thud. Patricia's hands shook violently as she tore open the seal, her eyes scanning the dense legal jargon. The bank was not just calling in the massive loans they had taken out against their family estate. The federal government was involved. The United States Department of Justice had officially frozen and seized the $1 million they had wired to Trent offshore account. The funds had been instantly flagged, intercepted, and liquidated by the SEC to compensate the hundreds of crypto investors Trent had defrauded. The money was gone. There was no appeals process, no legal loophole, and no high society favor they could call in. They had willingly funded a federal fugitive, and the government had stripped them bare. Richard collapsed into a dining chair, staring blankly at the granite countertops. The golden child they had banked their entire retirement on was entirely ruined, facing years in a federal penitentiary. Britney was unhireable, universally despised, and currently fighting DeAndre's brutal civil suit with a public defender because she could not afford a real attorney. The social circle that Richard and Patricia had spent decades crawling their way into had instantly shunned them. Their phone calls to wealthy friends went straight to voicemail. Their country club membership was quietly revoked. They had exactly 30 days to vacate the premises before the bank seized the property and changed the locks. They had no savings, no assets, and absolutely nowhere to go. Panic stripped away their pride. They packed whatever meager belongings they could fit into the trunk of Richard's aging sedan and drove straight to Chicago. They arrived in the downtown financial district just as a brutal, freezing rainstorm rolled off Lake Michigan. They parked illegally outside my luxury high-rise apartment building, their clothes instantly soaking through as they sprinted toward the grand glass entrance. Inside the pristine, marble-floored lobby, they looked entirely out of place. The high society illusion was completely washed away. Patricia's hair was plastered to her face, her designer coat ruined by the downpour. Richard looked incredibly old. His shoulders hunched his shoes, leaving dirty water tracks across the immaculate floor. They rushed the front desk frantically demanding to be led up to my penthouse. The concierge, a highly trained professional in an immaculate uniform, stepped firmly out from behind his desk to block their path to the private elevators. He held his hand up, his voice polite but unyielding. Madam has explicitly instructed security that she is not receiving unexpected visitors. I must ask you to step outside before I call the authorities. We are her parents! Patricia shrieked, her voice cracking hysterically as she gripped the edge of the security desk. You cannot throw us out in the rain. You do not understand. We have lost everything. We just need to speak with our daughter. Jocelyn has to help us. She is the executor of the Thornton estate. She has billions. She can fix this. Please just call up to her room. A soft melodic chime echoed through the expansive lobby. The polished silver doors of the private express elevator slid open. I stepped out, my posture perfectly straight, wearing a tailored charcoal suit that radiated absolute authority. DeAndre walked right beside me, his presence a silent, imposing guard against their chaos. I did not rush. I took my time walking across the marble floor, watching the desperate hope ignite in my parents' eyes. Jocelyn. Patricia sobbed, surging forward. The concierge moved to intercept her, but I raised a single hand, signaling him to stand down. Patricia stopped a few feet away, tears streaming down her face, mixing with the cold rain. Oh, sweetie, thank God. You have to help us. We have made a terrible mistake. Brittany lied to us. Trent lied to us. We lost the house. The government took our retirement. Richard stepped up beside her, trying to summon a pathetic remnant of his old paternal authority. Jocelyn, we are family. We know things have been strained, but we are your parents. You have the Thornton estate now. You have more money than you could ever spend. You have to help us pay the mortgage back. Just write a check to the bank, and we can put all this ugliness behind us. We can be a real family again. I did not scream. I did not raise my voice. I looked at the two people who had spent my entire childhood comparing me to my sister, who had mocked my career, who had actively conspired to trap me in a fraudulent marriage so they could profit off my misery. I reached into my designer leather tote bag and pulled out a single neatly folded piece of printer paper. Richard reached out eagerly, his hands trembling as he practically snatched the paper from my grip. He expected a cashier check. He expected a bank draft. He expected a financial lifeline. He quickly unfolded the paper, his eyes scanning the black text. His face fell, the desperate hope instantly draining away into pure, hollow shock. It was a printed list of low-income housing rentals, public assistance programs, and food banks located on the far outskirts of the city. I looked at them with absolute ice in my veins. My voice was calm, clear, and utterly devoid of pity. I am sorry, Patricia, I said, watching her eyes widen in horror. I am just a barren, bitter woman. I could not possibly help you. You told me to learn independence, Richard. It is your turn. I turned on my heel. I did not wait for their protests. I did not wait for the inevitable screaming or the begging. I walked straight toward the revolving glass doors with DeAndre right beside me, leaving them standing entirely alone in the lobby, clutching a piece of paper that represented the absolute reality of their new life. The federal courthouse was a stark, unforgiving environment, a far cry from the glittering corporate galas and velvet-roped VIP lounges Trent used to frequent. The air inside smelled of harsh floor wax and stale coffee, illuminated by flickering fluorescent lights that cast sickly shadows across the worn wooden benches. I sat quietly in the first row of the gallery, waiting for my name to be called. Trent was seated at the defense table. He looked entirely broken. His custom-tailored Italian suits and expensive imported watches were gone, replaced by a faded, ill-fitting gray suit provided by his assigned public defender. His meticulously styled hair was unkempt, and his signature arrogant posture had collapsed into a hollow, sunken-eyed panic. He was facing multiple federal charges for wire fraud and embezzlement, and he knew with absolute certainty that he had no defense. The prosecution called its star witness. I stood up, the rhythmic click of my heels echoing loudly in the dead-silent courtroom as I walked through the heavy oak swinging doors. I wore a sharp-tailored navy blue blazer and an expression of absolute professional detachment. I was not taking the stand as a scorned, bitter ex-wife. I was subpoenaed strictly as the prosecution premier expert forensic accountant. I raised my right hand, took the oath, and took my seat in the witness box. The lead federal prosecutor approached, handing me a copy of the 300-page financial dossier I had personally compiled and submitted to the Securities and Exchange Commission weeks earlier. For the next 2 hours, I clinically and emotionlessly dismantled Trent's entire financial existence. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of anger or vindictiveness. I simply read the numbers. I guided the judge and the jury through the complex labyrinth of his deception. I explained the exact offshore routing protocols he used to illegally siphon funds from his high-net-worth clients. I detailed the architecture of his fake cryptocurrency wallets, breaking down how he artificially inflated the numbers to create the illusion of massive returns. I pointed out the dummy limited liability companies he had registered in the Cayman Islands to hide the stolen cash. I provided the exact dates, times, and IP addresses of every illegal wire transfer he thought he had permanently deleted from his firm private servers. My methodology was bulletproof, verified, and authenticated by federal agents. As I spoke, I watched Trent from the corner of my eye, the remaining color completely drained from his face. He was staring at me, really looking at me, perhaps for the very first time in his entire life. He watched as I effortlessly explained complex blockchain manipulations and international tax evasion strategies that his own public defender could barely comprehend. The horrifying realization was washing over him in real time. He had spent 8 years treating me like a quiet, obedient accessory. He had genuinely believed his success was entirely his own doing, assuming he was the undeniable genius of the family. Sitting in that dingy courtroom facing decades of federal prison time, the truth finally hit him. I was the smartest person he had ever met. I was the one who had balanced his books, covered his tracks when he made sloppy accounting mistakes early in his career, and quietly held his entire fragile empire together. He had severely underestimated the woman standing behind him, and he had thrown me away for a manipulative influencer who bought anonymous donor sperm to trap him. The cross-examination was practically non-existent. His overworked public defender stood up, shuffled a few papers, and tried to poke holes in my forensic trail. It was a futile effort. Every single decimal point I presented was backed by irrefutable bank records. Every wire transfer had a matching digital signature tracing directly back to Trent's personal laptop. The defense rested their case shortly after declining to call a single witness, because there was absolutely no one left willing to defend him. The federal judge, a stern woman with zero tolerance for white-collar crime, did not take long to reach her decision. She looked down at Trent from the bench, her expression filled with absolute disgust. "You built a life of luxury on the backs of trusting investors," the judge stated, her voice echoing sharply through the quiet courtroom. "You manipulated the financial system, defrauded innocent people of their life savings, and showed zero remorse until you were caught." Trent stared at the floor, his shoulders trembling as the reality of his situation crushed down on him. For the charges of federal wire fraud and grand larceny, the judge continued, raising her heavy wooden gavel. "I sentence you to 5 years in a federal penitentiary. Furthermore, I am ordering full financial restitution. Every remaining asset you possess will be immediately liquidated to pay back the victims you defrauded." The heavy crack of the gavel struck the sounding block, sealing his fate. 2 armed federal marshals stepped forward immediately. They grabbed Trent by the arms, pulling him roughly to his feet. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs snapping around his wrists echoed through the room. As they dragged him toward the side door leading to the holding cells, he twisted his neck to look back at me. His eyes were wide and desperate, silently begging for some flicker of sympathy, some tiny sign that the woman who had loved him for 8 years was still in there. I looked right back at him. I did not smile. I did not frown. I simply gathered my financial files, placed them neatly into my leather briefcase, and turned my back on him forever. The sheer magnitude of the stress finally broke Brittany physically. Within 48 hours of her disastrous live stream and Trent, highly publicized federal sentencing, her body simply gave out. There was no glamorous sponsored maternity photo shoot. There was no private luxury birthing suite at a premium hospital with a dedicated team of holistic midwives. Instead, her water broke on the stained carpet of a cheap motel room she had rented after her credit cards were universally declined. She was rushed via standard ambulance to the nearest county hospital, her contractions tearing through her abdomen as she screamed at the paramedics to contact her publicist. They ignored her, focused purely on keeping her stable. The reality of her situation was a harsh, sterile room with flickering fluorescent lights and peeling linoleum floors. She gave birth to the twin boys completely and utterly alone. The nurses who attended to her exchanged looks of quiet pity. They had asked for her emergency contacts when she was admitted, but every single number was a dead end. Trent's phone was confiscated, his calls restricted to a monitored line inside a federal penitentiary holding cell. Her parents were entirely unreachable. Richard and Patricia, stripped of their wealth and their dignity, were currently hauling black garbage bags filled with their remaining clothes into a dilapidated, rust-stained trailer on the far south side of the city. They were too consumed by the shock of their own spectacular ruin to care about the daughter who had dragged them into it. For 2 days, Brittany lay in the stiff hospital bed staring at the cracked ceiling while the twins slept in standard plastic bassinets nearby. She had no makeup, no ring light, and no audience. The silence of the room was deafening. Her entire existence, built entirely on lies, stolen money, and manipulated perceptions, had evaporated into thin air. Then the heavy wooden door of her hospital room clicked open. Brittany turned her head, her exhausted, tear-streaked face instantly registering shock. DeAndre walked into the sterile room. He looked immaculate. He wore a sharply tailored navy suit, his posture radiating the kind of effortless authority and wealth she had spent her entire life trying to steal. He stopped at the foot of her bed, his expression completely unreadable. He did not look at the plastic bassinets holding the twins. He only looked at her. Brittany's narcissistic mind immediately twisted reality to fit her desperate needs. The fact that he was standing here meant he still cared. It meant her undeniable charm had worked one last time. He had seen her public humiliation, and his protective instincts had kicked in. She forced a weak, trembling smile, immediately turning on the waterworks she had practiced for her social media followers. "DeAndre," she whispered, her voice cracking perfectly. "I knew you would come. I was so wrong. Trent manipulated me. He forced me into everything. I have been so scared, and I am entirely alone. Please take me home. We can fix this. I know you still love me. You can adopt the boys. We can be a real family again." She reached her hand out toward him, fully expecting him to rush forward, take her hand, and promise to save her from the nightmare she had created. DeAndre did not move a single inch. He stood perfectly still, his eyes cold and devoid of any lingering affection. The man who had once loved her, who had trusted her with his life and his finances, was completely gone. In his place was a man who had systematically orchestrated her absolute destruction. "I am not here to save you, Brittany," he stated, his voice a low, smooth rumble that carried absolutely zero sympathy. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a crisp, heavy document. He stepped forward and dropped it directly onto her lap, right on top of her thin hospital blanket. Brittany stared at the paper. The bold black letters at the top of the page read, "Final Decree of Divorce." The judge fast-tracked the proceedings, DeAndre explained clinically, as if reading a corporate quarterly report. "Your complete failure to retain legal counsel made it incredibly simple. The emergency freeze on your assets is now permanent." The court reviewed the receipts from the Genesis Elite Fertility Clinic. They reviewed the bank transfers proving you embezzled marital funds to buy anonymous donor sperm. Based on the overwhelming evidence of marital fraud and grand larceny, the judge granted an absolute judgment in my favor. Brittany's hands began to shake uncontrollably as she fumbled with the pages. "No!" she gasped, her eyes scanning the brutal legal terminology. "You cannot do this. I am your wife. I have rights to your accounts." "You have absolutely nothing." DeAndre corrected his tone, turning razor sharp. The prenuptial agreement is null and void due to your criminal deception. You get zero alimony. You get zero access to my properties, my trusts, or my businesses. The only thing the court awarded you is the exclusive ownership of the debt you accumulated. The fertility clinic bills are entirely yours. The civil penalties are entirely yours. And this hospital stay is entirely yours. He looked down at her one last time, taking in the full measure of her pathetic, ruined state. She was staring at the divorce decree, hyperventilating, as the crushing weight of massive, unpayable debt settled onto her chest. She had no money, no home, no husband, and no family left to manipulate. DeAndre reached into his pocket one final time. He pulled out a single crisp $100 bill. He leaned over and placed it deliberately on the plastic hospital tray table next to her bed. For the Uber home, DeAndre said, his voice echoing with finality as he turned his back and walked toward the door. Since you sold the Porsche. The elevator ride back up to the penthouse was wrapped in a comfortable, heavy silence. The sound of the freezing rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling glass of the lobby faded into a quiet hum as we ascended. I looked at my reflection in the polished steel doors. I expected to feel a twinge of guilt, some lingering ghost of daughterly obligation regarding the two soaking wet people I had just left on the street. There was nothing, just a profound, sweeping emptiness that felt remarkably like peace. DeAndre stood beside me, his hands casually resting in his pockets. He watched the floor numbers tick upward before turning to look at me. "Remind me never to cross you," he said, his voice a low, appreciative rumble. That was the most surgically precise execution I have ever witnessed. I turned to him, finally letting out a long breath. I felt like I had been holding for my entire life. "They built the guillotine," I replied smoothly. I just released the blade. The days that followed brought a new kind of quiet to my life. The relentless noise of my family demands, Brittany's social media circus, and Trent fabricated financial emergencies was completely eradicated. But I was not built for idleness, and neither was DeAndre. We found ourselves spending hours in my home office, poring over the fallout of the bankruptcy proceedings and tracking the final legal maneuvers of his divorce. One evening, as we reviewed a particularly complex set of shell company documents, DeAndre closed his laptop and looked at me intensely. "We are wasting our time operating in separate spheres," he stated, leaning forward. "You are the most brilliant forensic accountant I have ever encountered. I am a corporate litigator who thrives on dismantling hostile entities. We just took down a federal criminal and a high society scam artist in a matter of weeks without breaking a sweat. Imagine what we could do if we actually charged for this level of destruction." He was entirely right. The synergy between us was undeniable. My ability to track hidden money through impenetrable digital labyrinths, combined with his ruthless, predatory grasp of corporate law, made us an absolute nightmare for anyone with something to hide. Within 48 hours, the paperwork was filed. We leased a sprawling glass-paneled corner office in the heart of downtown Chicago, overlooking the very financial district we intended to conquer. We named the firm Sterling and Vanguard Forensic Litigation. It sounded established, expensive, and intimidating. It was exactly what we were. The high society financial world is incredibly small, and corporate gossip travels faster than a wire transfer. We did not need to run a single advertisement. The details of Trent's spectacular ruin had become legendary in the boardrooms and exclusive country clubs. Everyone knew he was sitting in a federal cell, but more importantly, the power players knew exactly who had put him there. They knew about the woman who had quietly compiled a 300-page dossier that left the SEC speechless. Less than a month after opening our doors, our receptionist buzzed my office. We had a walk-in client who refused to speak to anyone but the founding partners. DeAndre and I walked into our pristine, mahogany-lined conference room to find the CEO of a major Fortune 500 logistics company standing by the window. He was a man who commanded billion-dollar industries, yet he looked visibly shaken. He did not waste time with pleasantries. He placed a heavy leather briefcase on the table. I have a hemorrhage in my C-suite, the CEO said, his voice tight with controlled panic. Someone on my executive board is bleeding the company dry through a network of offshore vendors. My internal auditors are useless. They are either too scared or too incompetent to find the leak. I need a ghost. He looked directly at me, his eyes sharp and appraising. I heard what you did to Trent Thornton. I heard you unraveled a highly encrypted crypto scam in 2 hours and handed the FBI a bow-tied conviction. I do not want standard accountants. I want a firing squad. I want you to find the rot, and I want your partner to legally obliterate whoever is responsible. DeAndre and I exchanged a single brief glance. We did not even need to speak. I slid a retainer agreement across the polished table. We require $250,000 up front, I said, my voice entirely flat. And we require absolute unrestricted access to your private servers. If there is a single manipulated cent in your ledgers, I will find it by Friday. The CEO signed the contract without blinking. The work was grueling, complex, and deeply satisfying. For 3 straight nights, we practically lived in the office. I traced the CEO missing funds through a convoluted maze of phantom shipping containers and dummy corporations based in Cyprus. DeAndre drafted the litigation traps, preparing the civil suits and asset freezes that would drop on the guilty executives the second I handed him the definitive proof. It was currently 2 a.m. on a Thursday. The rest of the city was completely dark, but our corner office was brightly illuminated. The massive glass windows reflected the glowing city skyline. My desk was buried under stacks of financial disclosures, highlighted bank statements, and 3 open laptops running complex extraction algorithms. In the center of the chaos sat 2 cardboard containers of spicy Szechuan noodles and a pair of wooden chopsticks. I rubbed my exhausted eyes, leaning back in my chair with a heavy sigh. I found it, I murmured, staring at the final decryption sequence on my main monitor. The chief financial officer has been routing the funds through a secondary payroll system. He is moving the cash in increments just below the federal reporting threshold. It is brilliant, but he made a routing error in a ledger from early last year. I have him. DeAndre let out a low whistle. He was sitting on the edge of my desk, his suit jacket discarded hours ago, the sleeves of his crisp white shirt rolled up to his elbows. He looked down at the data scrolling across my screen, then looked down at me. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly still. The frantic electric energy of the corporate hunt slowly faded, replaced by something much heavier and far more intimate. We had spent months fighting side by side. We had dismantled my abusive family, destroyed his parasitic ex-wife, and built an empire from the wreckage. We had been operating at maximum velocity for so long that we had never actually stopped to look at what was growing between us. DeAndre reached across the desk, carefully pushing aside a stack of audit reports. He did not say a word. He simply rested his large, warm hand over mine. His thumb gently traced the knuckles of my fingers. The touch sent a sudden, sharp shockwave straight to my chest. I looked up, meeting his dark, intense gaze. The professional boundary we had meticulously maintained instantly dissolved. There was no more strategy, no more corporate warfare, and no more hiding behind our armor. It was just us alone in the sky, exactly where we were always meant to be. The morning after that late-night revelation in our office, the entire dynamic of Sterling and Vanguard shifted. There was no awkwardness, no hesitation. DeAndre and I moved with a synchronized precision that transcended professional boundaries. We were a united front, a perfectly calibrated machine. By the end of our first official month in business, we had not only eradicated the logistics CEO internal hemorrhage, but had secured 3 more high-net-worth retainers. To commemorate our unprecedented launch, Helen insisted on hosting a private celebration. Trent Mother had remained a steadfast, unyielding pillar of support throughout the entire ordeal. While typical high society matriarchs would have hidden in shame during their son's highly publicized federal sentencing, Helen had simply changed her country club schedule and doubled down on her investments. She was a woman of absolute pragmatism. She recognized rot when she saw it, even when it shared her DNA. She booked a private dining room at Alinea Chicago's most exclusive Michelin star establishment, The room was a masterpiece of understated luxury, walled in dark mahogany and illuminated by a modern cascading crystal chandelier. The ambient noise of the main dining room was completely sealed off, leaving us in a sanctuary of quiet elegance. Helen sat at the head of the table, radiating the kind of effortless old money authority that my own parents had spent their entire lives desperately trying to fake. She wore a tailored emerald silk dress, her posture impeccable, raising a glass of vintage champagne. To Sterling and Vanguard, Helen announced, her sharp, intelligent eyes gleaming with genuine pride. I always knew you were destined to build an empire, Jocelyn. I am just thrilled you finally found a partner who operates at your exact altitude. DeAndre raised his glass, sitting comfortably close to me. His hand rested lightly on the back of my chair, a silent but undeniable claim of our new reality. It is entirely her architecture, Helen, he replied smoothly, taking a sip of the champagne. I am just the legal artillery. Jocelyn is the sniper. Helen let out a rich, throaty laugh that echoed warmly in the private room. Oh, please. I have read the corporate filings you drafted for that logistics firm counselor. You two are the most terrifying legal and financial combination this city has seen in a decade. The multi-course tasting menu was a culinary symphony, but the food was secondary to the profound sense of belonging that washed over me. I sat in a 3-star Michelin restaurant across from my former mother-in-law, my hand subtly resting on the thigh of the man who used to be married to my manipulative sister. We were a bizarre, beautiful constellation of people brought together by the sheer destruction of the toxic parasites who had tried to ruin us. As the immaculate waitstaff cleared our final dessert plates and poured our after-dinner espresso, Helen's demeanor shifted. The celebratory lightness settled into something much deeper and deeply serious. She reached into her vintage Chanel handbag and withdrew a small, worn velvet box. It looked ancient, the deep navy fabric slightly faded at the corners, speaking to decades of careful preservation. She placed it gently on the pristine white tablecloth and slid it across to me. I looked at the box, then up at Helen. Her usual sharp, business-minded expression had softened completely. Open it, she instructed quietly. I released the small brass clasp and lifted the lid. Resting on a bed of aged cream satin was a breathtaking diamond and sapphire brooch. It was intricately designed, crafted in the shape of a blooming lotus flower, with a massive, flawless sapphire resting directly in the center, surrounded by a halo of crushed diamonds. The craftsmanship was undeniably vintage, the kind of bespoke jewelry that is passed down through generations, kept locked in heavy steel bank vaults. Helen, I breathed, staring at the priceless heirloom. I cannot accept this. It is far too valuable. That brooch belonged to my great-grandmother, Helen said, her voice steady but thick with emotion. She smuggled it out of Europe, sewn into the lining of her coat. It was passed to my grandmother, then to my mother, and then to me. It is a Thornton family legacy, strictly meant to be given to the true daughter of the house. I looked up, my vision blurring slightly. Helen, Trent and I are divorced. I am no longer a Thornton. Helen reached across the table and covered my hands with hers. Her grip was warm and fiercely protective. Trent was a biological accident, she stated, her words carrying the heavy weight of absolute truth. He shares my blood, but he possesses none of my character, none of my integrity, and none of my strength. I mourned the son I thought I had a long time ago. But you, Jocelyn, you stayed. You fought for yourself. You protected my assets when you had every right to let us all burn. She squeezed my hands tightly, looking directly into my eyes. Trent was my blood, but you are my family, Jocelyn. You are the daughter I always wanted. You are the heir to my legacy. I want you to wear it. A single tear escaped my eye, tracing a hot path down my cheek. My own biological parents, Patricia and Richard, had spent my entire childhood treating me like a disposable commodity. They had abandoned me, belittled me, and ultimately tried to bleed me dry to save their own pathetic illusions of grandeur. Yet here, in this quiet, luxurious room, the mother of the man who had betrayed me was crowning me as her true daughter. I picked up the heavy sapphire brooch, my fingers trembling slightly, and pinned it securely to the lapel of my blazer. It felt right. It felt like armor. Thank you. I whispered, my voice thick. It means everything to me. Helen smiled a beautiful, genuine expression of peace. She then slowly turned her gaze away from me and focused entirely on DeAndre. Her eyes narrowed slightly, returning to the sharp, formidable matriarch who commanded boardrooms. Take care of her, counselor, Helen said, her voice dropping to a serious, uncompromising register. She is the absolute best thing that ever happened to us. Do not ever let her forget her worth. DeAndre did not hesitate. He did not break eye contact with Helen. He reached under the table, his hand finding mine, and locking our fingers together with a firm, unyielding grip. You have my word. Helen, DeAndre promised, his voice a deep, resonant vow that echoed through the room. I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure no one ever underestimates her again. 6 months later, the ashes of the Thornton Empire had completely blown away, leaving behind a stark, permanent new reality. Deep inside the concrete bowels of a federal penitentiary, Trent plunged a cheap plastic brush into a heavily stained toilet bowl. The harsh, suffocating smell of industrial bleach burned his nostrils, a sharp contrast to the custom-blended cologne he used to wear. His designer suits had been replaced by a coarse, faded khaki uniform that hung loosely on his shrinking frame. The man who had once commanded opulent boardrooms and siphoned millions from high society investors now spent 8 hours a day scrubbing the communal latrines of C Block. His meticulously manicured hands were raw, covered in cracked skin and chemical burns. A corrections officer banged a heavy baton against the metal doorframe, barking at Trent to work faster. Trent flinched, keeping his head down and his mouth shut. The arrogant, untouchable golden boy had been entirely eradicated, replaced by a hollow, broken inmate facing another 4.5 years of agonizing daily humiliation. 1,000 miles away, the relentless, piercing beep of a barcode scanner served as the soundtrack to Brittany' absolute ruin. She stood behind the counter of a discount dollar store in a rundown strip mall, wearing a stiff polyester uniform vest over a cheap t-shirt. Her feet throbbed in imitation sneakers as she scanned expired coupons for impatient, aggressive customers who did not care about her past life as a luxury influencer. There were no ring lights, no sponsored brand deals, and no fawning followers. When her agonizing 10-hour shift finally ended, she took a public bus back to a cramped, windowless studio apartment that smelled faintly of mildew. She unlocked the thin door to the sound of 2 infant boys screaming simultaneously. She had zero help, zero money, and a mountain of legal debt from her fraudulent fertility clinic schemes that would garnish her minimum wage paychecks for the rest of her life. She collapsed onto a stained secondhand mattress, staring blankly at the peeling paint on the ceiling, completely trapped in the poverty she had so desperately tried to manipulate her way out of. Richard and Patricia were also discovering the brutal, unforgiving nature of the working class. Stripped of their stolen retirement funds and forcefully evicted from their sprawling estate, they had relocated to a rusting, drafty trailer park on the far outskirts of the city. To pay off the massive federal penalties and keep the electricity running in their dilapidated mobile home, they had been forced to take jobs as greeters at a massive big-box retail store. Richard, who used to boast about his country club handicap, now stood on hard concrete floors for 8 hours a day, handing out shopping carts and enduring the casual disrespect of hurried shoppers. Patricia suffered an even worse fate. She was required to wear a bright blue company vest and a plastic name tag while checking customer receipts at the exit doors. One afternoon, a group of wealthy women from her former country club walked through the automatic doors. Patricia tried to turn her face away, but it was too late. The women stopped, stared at her, uniform exchanged looks of profound, silent pity, and walked past without saying a single word. The social exile was absolute. They had lost their money, their status, and their pride. High above the misery of the people who had tried to destroy me, the air was pristine and perfectly still. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of my Chicago penthouse, looking out over the glittering, sprawling city skyline. The city lights reflected in the glass, mirroring the brilliant sparkle of the vintage diamond and sapphire brooch pinned elegantly to the lapel of my tailored black silk gown. The heirloom Helen had given me rested heavily over my heart, a constant, beautiful reminder of the empire DeAndre and I had built together. Sterling and Vanguard. Forensic litigation had become the most feared and respected boutique firm in the financial district. We were unstoppable, tearing through corporate fraud with ruthless precision. The soft clinking of ice against crystal drew my attention. I turned to see DeAndre walking across the polished hardwood floor carrying 2 glasses of expensive scotch. He had discarded his suit jacket and tie, the top buttons of his crisp white shirt undone, after a long, highly profitable week at the firm. He looked incredibly handsome, the ambient light of the city casting sharp angles across his jawline. He stopped right in front of me, handing me a glass. His eyes traced the line of my jaw, moving down to the sapphire brooch, and finally meeting my gaze. "To the most brilliant woman I have ever known," DeAndre murmured, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that sent a warm shiver straight down my spine. We clinked our glasses together, the crystal ringing with a clear, bright chime. I took a sip of the scotch, the complex burn of the liquor perfectly matching the electric tension hanging in the air between us. DeAndre reached out gently, taking the glass from my hand and placing it alongside his own on a nearby marble table. He turned back to me, eliminating the remaining distance between us. He reached up his large, warm hands, gently cupping my face. His thumbs softly brushed my cheekbones, his touch sending a rush of absolute certainty through my veins. "I promised Helen I would spend the rest of my life taking care of you," he whispered. His dark eyes entirely focused on mine, filled with an unwavering, fierce devotion. And I am a man who always keeps his promises. He leaned down, bridging the final gap, and kissed me. It was not rushed or frantic. It was deliberate, passionate, and deeply grounding. All the unspoken romantic tension we had carefully navigated through months of corporate warfare and legal battles finally shattered, replaced by a profound, undeniable connection. I wrapped my arms around his neck, pulling him closer, anchoring myself to the man who had stood by me when my entire world was up in flames. When we finally parted, DeAndre wrapped his arms securely around my waist from behind, pulling my back flush against his chest. I leaned into his solid, protective warmth, turning my gaze back out toward the endless sea of city lights. My bank accounts were overflowing, my career was legendary, and the man holding me loved me with absolute, unwavering loyalty. The people who had tried to bury me in their lies were currently drowning in the miserable realities they had created for themselves. I smiled, a slow, deeply satisfied expression of pure victory. I had not just survived the fire they tried to burn me in. I had harnessed the flames, melted down their fragile illusions, and forged my own impenetrable crown. The most profound lesson woven throughout these narratives is that true family isn't strictly defined by bloodlines, but by mutual respect, unwavering support, and genuine love. When individuals are trapped in toxic environments, constantly belittled, scapegoated, or financially exploited by those who should protect them, the ultimate victory isn't found in bitter revenge. Instead, true triumph comes from walking away and fiercely rebuilding your life on your own terms. Establishing firm boundaries allows you to replace a legacy of manipulation with a self-made empire of authenticity and peace. Have you ever had to draw a hard line with toxic relatives to protect your own peace? Share your story in the comments below.